History is not written only by the things we see on the surface. It is woven from the quiet movements beneath every civilization, the moments no one recorded, the choices that slipped by as quickly as a breath, yet had the power to change the course of the world. Sometimes it takes only a rising tide that no one notices. An unnamed season of melting ice, a single wave touching an old shore, and an entire continent disappears without a single war. Beneath the pale green waters off Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam lies a land that once stretched for thousands of kilometers, a vast world whose people never knew it would soon vanish from the map. They lived along rivers that merged into a great, fertile superplain, lit their fires under a night sky thick with stars, and believed the ground beneath their feet would last forever. But the sea, even when it rises slowly like a low, steady melody, is always more patient than human memory. Year after year, hunting fields turned into salty marshes, forests sank into deep bays, and the rivers that once ran like the lifelines of the continent disappeared under darkening water. The earliest communities simply drifted inland, carrying with them fragments of memory that later generations would never fully understand. But that world did not vanish. It only slipped beneath tens of meters of water, waiting to be named again through science, through sonar reaching across the seafloor, through sediments rising from the old earth, and through fragments of DNA still alive within hundreds of millions of Southeast Asians today. And so, the journey of telling history is not just about finding lost civilizations. It is about finding pieces of ourselves, the memories humanity thought it had long surrendered to the sea. In every episode of Historical Storytell, we step into that boundary, a place where light is not strong enough to reveal everything, yet darkness is not deep enough to hide it all, a place where history is not told through wars or ruins, but through the soft, human pulse beneath them. Prepare yourself. Because sometimes, if we listen at just the right moment, the entire world opens in a completely different way. When the story of the Sunda continent begins to unfold, we must turn the clock back to a completely different world, a world where the shapes of continents and oceans looked nothing like the familiar boundaries we see on maps today. Around 20,000 years ago, the Earth was locked in the coldest phase of the last ice age. Ice sheets stretched from northern Europe to North America, pressing down on the land with a weight so immense that the very crust beneath them sank, like a tired body collapsing under a blanket far too heavy. The air was drier, colder, and the winds swept endlessly across white plains that we can now only imagine through a handful of old illustrations. At that time, the rise and fall of the sea was not something humans could easily perceive. They had no maps, no elevation lines, no vantage point from which to measure the ocean creeping forward or retreating. All they knew was that the land before them seemed wider, the floodplains longer, and the hunting grounds stretched farther before meeting water. Yet the reason for this vast expanse lay in the thick sheets of ice at both ends of the Earth, ice that locked away an enormous volume of water, causing global sea levels to drop more than 120 meters. And at that moment, Southeast Asia began to reveal a shape that humanity would only reconstruct thousands of years later through geology. During that period, the spaces we now call the South China Sea, the Java Sea, and the Strait of Malacca were not seas at all. They were part of a continuous landmass stretching from Vietnam to Malaysia, reaching out to Sumatra, Java, and Borneo, forming a supercontinent scientists now call Sunda. This was not merely a large island. It was an entire continent, with dense tropical rainforests, immense river systems, and wide grasslands that seemed to run endlessly toward the horizon. The regions that today lie beneath tens of meters of water were once places where people built fires, hunted during the dry season, and walked paths that generations had trodden before them. The climate of Sunda was nothing like the frozen north. Sitting entirely within the tropical belt, the land received generous monsoon rains, nurturing deep green forests that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Between these forests were vast grasslands, where large animals migrated with the seasons. The wildlife was so abundant that even the savannas of modern Africa would struggle to compare. Ancient elephants, wild cattle, giant deer, boar, the Javan tiger, and countless birds and reptiles all shared a continent we can now picture only in fragments. But the most astonishing feature of Sunda was its river systems. With sea levels so low, rivers did not branch into the scattered deltas we know today. Instead, they merged into colossal waterways, what researchers call the Sunda Mega River System. From highlands now belonging to Vietnam and Cambodia, multiple streams joined into vast basins, flowing across what is now the South China Sea and emptying near modern-day Java. These rivers were the lifeblood of the people who lived there, places where they hunted, camped, moved with the seasons, and exchanged knowledge in ways we can only infer from the few tools that remain. Humans had lived on this land long before the sea rose to swallow it. Evidence from Naya Cave in Borneo shows modern humans were present at least 40,000 years ago. It may be that this immense and fertile continent became a major migration corridor as humans left Africa, moved deeper into Asia, and eventually reached Australia. Their earliest footsteps crossed landscapes that now lie hidden beneath the waves. This is why, when we speak of Southeast Asian human history, we cannot overlook Sunda, not merely as an ancient landmass, but as a vital bridge in one of humanity's greatest journeys. This was the first world, a world our eyes can no longer see, yet one that remains in the sediments beneath the sea, in the strands of our DNA, and in the imagination that tries to restore a map long erased by time. And once we understand the Earth's shape in that distant era, we begin to see more clearly how the fate of Sunda was set in motion. A long story told most quietly by water and by time. When we look at a modern map, Southeast Asia appears as a scattering of islands and peninsulas, each with its own shape, its own shorelines, as if they were never connected. But in that distant time, when the seas were low, when the great rivers still flowed across open ground instead of sinking into the depths, this entire region formed a single, continuous landmass, so vast that it is almost impossible for us today to imagine it ever existed. Only when geologists reconstructed the sea levels of the Ice Age did the shape of the Sunda supercontinent emerge, like a memory long hidden beneath the water. Back then, what is now Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the shallow shelves of the South China Sea were fused into one sweeping expanse, stretching thousands of kilometers. It was an entirely different world, a geographic portrait that, without science, we might easily mistake for fiction. At that time, the South China Sea was a wide valley where ancient rivers converged, carrying silt from the highlands into mirror-flat floodplains. The Strait of Malacca, now crowded with ships, was once a shallow corridor where streams wandered between stretches of grassland. And the region surrounding Java, today the heart of modern Indonesia, was merely the southern edge of a landmass that reached all the way to mainland Southeast Asia. A person living then, standing on the Sunda Shelf, could have walked from what is now Vietnam all the way to Borneo, simply by following the course of the great rivers. In that era, ideas of nations, borders, or territories did not exist. Instead, there were open landscapes, grasslands tucked between tropical forests, low mountain ridges, and sunken basins where fresh water gathered in the monsoon season. And at the center of everything were the rivers, not a single river, but an entire network formed by multiple enormous waterways. Today, scientists call it the Sunda River System, once one of the largest ancient river networks humanity has ever known. These rivers did more than create fertile plains. They served as natural highways, connecting prehistoric groups. Ancient people traveled along them, across hunting grounds, thick with tracks of large animals, through humid, shadowed forests, forming interactions that archaeology now glimpses only through scattered tools, stone fragments, and faint patches of ash. Even small groups of a few dozen individuals, living from fish, small game, and forest plants, could meet seasonally, exchange languages, share skills, and tell stories that would never be written down. It was in these now submerged landscapes that the earliest cultural foundations of Southeast Asia began to take shape. What made Sunda remarkable was not only its size, but its position. This continent sat precisely at the crossroads between two worlds, the Asian mainland and the long chain of Indonesian islands stretching toward Australia. Sunda was the gateway through which early humans moved southward, crossing the famous biological boundary known as the Wallace Line, the line dividing Asian and Australian fauna. But in that era, when land stretched far and the sea had not yet reclaimed its borders, humans used Sunda as a stepping stone, pushing farther than nature seemed to allow. This explains why the genetic landscape of Southeast Asian populations today carries such deep, interwoven roots. From Vietnam to Malaysia, from Indonesia to Papua New Guinea, shared genetic signals still whisper of origins far older than we once imagined. As ancient DNA research expands, it becomes clear that the people of modern islands carry fragments of ancestral memory, pieces of a world that existed on Sunda before it sank. In that time, every footstep across its vast plains was not only a movement through space, but a movement through the early history of humankind. Yet perhaps the most striking thing is how Sunda revealed a geography entirely opposite of what we know today. Standing on what is now the floor of the Java Sea, looking north, a person would have seen the mountains of Vietnam fading in tropical haze, not an endless stretch of deep blue water. Looking west, they would have seen Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula connected as a single great arm of land. In that landscape, Southeast Asia was not a world of seas, but a world of land. Not a story of separation, but of unity. And it was that very unity that allowed later climate changes to reshape the destiny of this region in ways no one living then could have foreseen. Because when a continent is born from water, it can be taken back by water, quietly, slowly, gently, like the first waves touching a shoreline. Waves that seem meaningless until we realize they are the opening notes of a separation that will last for millennia. As the shape of the Sunda supercontinent begins to form in our imagination, with endless stretches of dense rainforest and sunlit grasslands spreading across wide valleys, a natural question rises in our minds. What nourished such an immense land? At that time, there was no South China Sea, no deep bays with waves crashing against rocky coasts, no dark blue horizons like we see today. Instead, there were dry, sweeping valleys reaching far into the distance, and at the center of this entire landscape, the heartbeat of the continent came from its ancient rivers. These rivers were unlike anything that exists in the region today. They were larger, longer, and stronger, as if the grandeur of a young continent was carving its presence into the earth. Scientists believe that 4 or 5 major rivers merged to form a massive mega-river system, that flowed across what is now the floor of the South China Sea, before emptying toward the southwest, near Java. The people of that time had no names for these rivers. They simply lived beside them, followed their flows with the seasons, and treated them as the silent lifelines of the world they belonged to. But when we look back through sediment models and sonar images of the seafloor, we see those ancient channels like enormous veins that once carried water, silt, and life across the continent. Among them was the most prominent, now often called by scientists, the Mother River of Sunda, an ancient confluence formed by rivers we consider entirely separate today. The Mekong, the Chao Phraya, the Rajang, the Baram, and even older river branches from what is now Vietnam. Water began its journey from the mountains of Yunnan, from the Annamite Range, from the old Malaysian forests, meeting in a vast valley now lying tens of meters underwater. They flowed together, bearing sediment, and in merging, they created a floodplain comparable to the great river deltas of history, rivaling even the Nile or Mesopotamia. For the people of Sunda, rivers were not boundaries. They were natural open roads. They led hunters to richer grounds, fishermen to abundant waters, and families to higher ground when the monsoon arrived. Movement was not only for survival, it was an opportunity for encounter. Along riverbanks, groups exchanged stone spearheads, shell tools, fire-making stones, and perhaps stories that no archaeological trace could ever preserve. The earliest cultures of Southeast Asia were not formed by a central authority. They were woven from these soft connections, people following water, meeting, sharing, and transforming. Today, the remains of this river system survive only as deep channels on the seafloor and layers of silt found in sediment cores from the South China Sea. Yet even these traces tell us much. They reveal how fertile the land once was: mangrove forests lining riverbanks, vast dry-season grasslands, and shimmering freshwater lakes scattered along the floodplains, magnetizing wildlife, and in turn, drawing humans. Places now covered by waves were once where ancient elephants bathed, where Javan tigers hunted, where early humans built fires in the humid tropical dusk. Sunda's greatest distinction lies in the fact that its rivers shaped not only life, but movement. The great currents running east-west and north-south formed a natural migration network, allowing humans to spread across the continent far faster than they could by pushing through thick rainforest alone. In that era, riverbeds were so wide that even when sea levels were at their lowest, they remained large enough to function as migration corridors. Because of this, many anthropologists believe Sunda played a crucial role in the human wave that reached Australia around 50,000 years ago. A slow, steady journey along waterways that no longer exist. Perhaps the most evocative truth is that these rivers no longer flow across land. They still exist, but only as shadows of history, visible in the deep blue contours of seafloor maps. They remind us gently that not every river runs on the surface. Some flow through the past, drifting in the Earth's memory, resurfacing only when we learn how to look deeply. And once we understand the rivers that shaped Sunda, we begin to reach the next question. The question of the people who lived along those ancient banks, and what they managed to leave behind before the rising seas took everything away. As the ancient rivers of Sunda emerge before us like lifelines that once pulsed steadily across that vast continent, we are naturally drawn to the next question. What did the land around them look like? Rivers never exist in empty space. They are always accompanied by forests, grasses, dry high banks, or shadowed wetlands. Together, these elements formed an ecological landscape so rich that between 18,000 and 12,000 years ago, it may have been one of the most diverse environments on Earth. During that period, Sunda's climate was not frozen like Europe, not arid like the Middle East, and not merely an endless jungle as many imagine Southeast Asia today. Instead, Sunda was a blend of multiple ecosystems, each with its own character, yet working together in a natural harmony. In the lowlands where river branches met, the climate was noticeably warm and humid, giving rise to tropical forests stretching hundreds of kilometers. From these forests, dense canopies blocked the sky, allowing only thin, golden rays of sunlight to fall like drifting dust onto the forest floor. Fleeting trails of brightness resting on a sea of deep green. The rainforests of ancient Sunda were likely so biodiverse that even the modern Amazon would struggle to match them. But the most surprising features appeared where forest met open land, with sea levels low and the continent far larger than it is today. Vast grasslands emerged, like great breadths of open space between the trees. These fields stretched from what is now southern Vietnam all the way to the central Java shelf, home to large animals such as wild cattle, tapirs, sambar deer, and especially ancient elephants that traveled in herds of hundreds. Their presence suggests not only great richness, but remarkable environmental stability lasting thousands of years. Ideal conditions for prehistoric hunter-gatherers. Between these transition zones, where water flowed from forest to low grass, wetlands formed. These were the domains of fish, water birds, amphibians, and countless reptiles. And within these wetlands, traces of ancient life survived most clearly. Shards of bone, scattered ash, slivers of charcoal from old fires, small fragments that, millennia later, became clues, allowing us to retrace the human past. Sunda also had another ecological layer, the realm of seasonally flooded lands. The climate then was strongly monsoonal. When the rains arrived, millions of cubic meters of water spilled across forests, plains, and grasslands, creating temporary inland seas that forced both animals and people to adapt. During these months, the higher ground became gathering places where small human groups met, shared food and tools, and traded stories of seasons past. When the waters receded, they dispersed along the rivers again, returning to their nomadic rhythm. Seen through a modern lens, this landscape resembles a fusion of the Mekong Valley, Borneo's rainforest, and Australia's grasslands. But in that ancient time, these regions were not separated. They were one continuous whole, where a prehistoric person could walk from northern forest to southern savanna in a matter of days, while today the same journey requires crossing hundreds of kilometers of open sea. The abundance of wildlife reflected this continuity. The Javan tiger once roamed across all of Sunda, not isolated as it became in later eras. Massive wild buffalo and banteng cattle traveled in herds so large that modern imagination can barely grasp it. Water birds, turtles, fish, small mammals, all contributed to a vast reservoir of life that supported not only survival, but steady human flourishing. Without ever facing prolonged cold or chronic scarcity, ancient people had the time to observe, to remember, to learn the rhythms of land and water, and to accumulate early forms of knowledge, fragments of which survive only in cave layers or buried marine sediments. It may be because of this environmental stability and abundance that the people of Sunda developed such deep adaptability. They knew when to follow the rivers, which plants were edible in both dry and wet seasons, which tracks belonged to large herds, and how the direction of water could lead them to fish. These skills later became the foundation for those who continued their journey outward, leaving the Sunda continent, moving across Wallacea, and eventually reaching the distant islands the modern world calls Oceania. Yet no matter how abundant the environment, everything eventually yields to a greater force: climate. And from here, the story begins to shift into a different rhythm. No longer the expansion of land, but its slow, gentle, and irreversible retreat as the earth warmed and the waters began their long return to the sea. As we observe the rich ecosystems of ancient Sunda, where open grasslands unfurled between dense forests and wide rivers flowed like green ribbons across the land, we begin to understand why humans chose this region as one of the most important stopping points on their journey out of Africa. The first modern human footprints here were likely not the result of wandering by chance. They appeared because this land offered one of the gentlest paths for a species learning to adapt to every terrain on Earth. Those early footsteps, taken more than 40,000 years ago, did more than open a new place to live. They laid the genetic foundation for hundreds of millions of Southeast Asians today. The earliest evidence of human presence in the region was found in Naya Cave on the island of Borneo. In its dark sediment layers, bones more than 35,000 years old tell a simple yet profound story. Someone once lived, ate, and hunted amid the forest savanna landscape of Sunda. Though silent, those bones quietly reveal that ancient humans were capable of moving across distances so vast that we would scarcely believe it if we relied only on modern maps. But Naya is only one of many windows into the past. Stone tools in Flores, early traces on the Malay Peninsula, ash remains in coastal Sumatra caves, all are small fragments in a larger picture. Humans arrived in Sunda very early, and they stayed far longer than we once imagined. In that time, small human groups, sometimes only a few dozen individuals, lived by following seasonal rhythms. They hunted deer, fished in wide rivers, gathered forest fruits through the long months of rain, and likely developed a deep knowledge of plants that is now nearly impossible for us to reconstruct. What made them remarkable was not their tools or techniques, but their ability to adapt to a landscape that changed with every shift in the monsoon. They watched herds move, remembered where water remained in the dry season, knew which soils hid edible roots, and which signaled wild beehives. These lessons accumulated across generations, passed down beside firelight, becoming part of a quiet collective memory. But perhaps the greatest strength of ancient Sunda people lay in their movement. Sunda was not just a home, it was a vast migration corridor connecting Asia to the islands farther south. At that time, when the Sunda Shelf still rose above water and the seas had not yet formed the immense barriers we see today, ancient humans followed riverbanks, crossed lowlands, and eventually reached Wallacea, the geologically distinct island region beyond the continental shelf. From there, they journeyed even farther, reaching the Great Islands and ultimately arriving in Australia. Ancient DNA evidence shows that the ancestors of today's indigenous Australians and Papuans carry clear signatures of communities that once lived on Sunda. This means that in humanity's great migration story, Sunda served as a station, a gateway, a transitional world where skills, memories, and resilience were carried southward. In their own time, they could not have known they were crossing a continent, nor could they imagine that tens of thousands of years later, the places where they lit their fires would lie deep beneath the sea. They moved simply for food, for water, and perhaps from the same instinct that still drives humans to explore new horizons. Yet through each fragment of charcoal, each broken stone tool, we sense that their lives were more than survival, that they held a subtle intuition for the land. They chose campsites with wide views, shaped blades from river stones, and buried their dead on higher ground, as if believing those places offered greater peace. These communities were not a civilization in the traditional sense. They built no cities, had no writing, and raised no temples. But they left behind something deeper, the imprint of life and presence itself. Their genetic echoes survive in millions of people from Vietnam to Indonesia. Their migration routes are still visible in linguistic maps. Their tools still rest under layers of sediment that the sea continues to shape. And when we bend down to look at those traces, we realize that the people of Sunda did not disappear. They simply changed form, just as the continent that sustained them did. From here, the story naturally descends into a deeper layer. How did they live among those rivers, those grasslands, and those forests? How did they organize their communities? And what did daily life look like on a continent that now exists only in the memory of the sea? As the first human footsteps echoed across that vast land, the story was not only about where they came from, but about how they lived, how they found food, how they bonded with one another in a world where every forest, every grassland, and every river branch was still as pristine as the morning of its creation. Before the rising seas erased all traces, their lives moved to rhythms we can now only reconstruct from broken stones, fossilized pollen, and silent layers of charcoal resting beneath the ocean floor. In those days, the lands we now call the South China Sea and the Java Sea were not deep blue waters. They were a wide, flat plain, so expansive that a person could walk for tens of kilometers without encountering a cliff face or a wall of dense forest. Scientists call this region the Sunda Plain, but to the people who lived there, it needed no name. It was simply the living ground, the hunting ground, the path that connected them to other groups. This plain was larger than the Indus Valley or ancient Mesopotamia, a sparse world full of large animals and a night sky blazing with stars, untouched by artificial light. For seasonal moving groups, shelter was never elaborate, yet never entirely temporary. They chose high mounds near rivers or along the grassland edge to avoid monsoon floods. Wooden poles and broad leaves were used to build conical or curved roof shelters, sturdy enough to withstand seasonal winds, yet easy to dismantle when it was time to move. They did not build villages in the way we imagine today, but there were resting places used again and again across generations. The layers of charcoal stacked in the soil are the slow-written record of fires that burned over thousands of years. Hunting played the central role in this rhythm of life. The Sunda grasslands were not places where humans had to chase tiny prey in desperation. They were homelands of great migrating herds. The tracks of ancient elephants, giant deer, wild boar, and banteng pressed into the wet earth. And the people of Sunda read those marks the way one reads the pages of a book. They distinguished fresh tracks from old ones, recognized which animals were injured, and could even predict the movement of a herd as dusk approached. Their tools were simple: pointed spears, stone axes, blades chipped from hard rock, but sharp enough to weave them into the pulse of the land. Along the great rivers, they fished with woven baskets, stone traps, and rows of wooden stakes forming natural weirs where fish were caught as the waters receded. Evidence of these techniques has been found in ancient sediments in Borneo and the Malay Peninsula, showing that this simple yet effective method once spread across the entire Sunda region. Fish, turtles, freshwater crabs, and shellfish became reliable protein sources, especially when large animals moved to distant grasslands. Yet life was not only hunting and fishing. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient Sunda people gathered many types of seeds, tubers, and fruits. They knew which seasons the forest would be heavy with fruit, which seasons required relying on roots, and when wild bees formed their hives. This understanding was not mere instinct. It was knowledge accumulated through generations. Children in these communities did not only learn to walk and speak, they learned to smell the grass signaling rain, to listen to frogs, to predict water levels, and to read the color of leaves to find honey. These small communities connected with one another in gentle, fluid ways. There were no large-scale wars, no borders. As they traveled, they left messages. A branch snapped sideways, a stone placed slightly to the left, subtle signs for others. When different groups met, they traded tools, shared information about migrating herds, or simply rested beside one another for a night. The land was wide, the population sparse. Cooperation was the most sustainable choice. Perhaps on those nameless plains, under firelight, they told stories. Stories of a successful hunt, of a river that changed its course, of a distant land a relative had once passed through. These stories were never written down, but they became the material of memory, threads of a collective knowledge carried through time. Within this flow of life, the people of Sunda formed a soft kind of social structure, not fixed like villages, yet not entirely nomadic. It was a blend of stability and movement, of belonging and adaptation, of memory and experimentation. A pattern of life that could only blossom in a rich environment like Sunda, a place that did not force people to choose between life and death, but granted them the time to observe, to learn, to adjust. Yet even as their lives reached this natural stability, we know that beneath the calm surface lay a quiet undercurrent. Climate change. Slow, nearly invisible from day to day, but persistent, irreversible. And it would soon open a new chapter, one where the landscape transformed, and with it, the way humans lived upon a continent that was beginning its long, gentle retreat. When we look back at life on that vast plain, where small human groups moved with the seasons and built their camps along rivers or atop high mounds, it is easy to assume they were merely primitive, standing outside the scale of civilization that modern history so often uses. But that assumption is only an illusion born from our impatience to judge the past by the standards of the present. Even though they built no cities and raised no temples, these early people developed techniques and knowledge that challenge our definitions of what advanced truly means. The humans who lived in Sunda's forest savanna world were not simply surviving. They were constantly refining, observing their environment with the precision of scientists, remembering natural cycles like philosophers, and applying local knowledge with a subtlety that later cultures took millennia to achieve. At that time, stone tool technology in the Sunda region had reached an astonishing level of sophistication. On the island of Flores, extraordinarily sharp stone blades, thin enough to rival Middle Eastern obsidian, have been found. Their edges, as fine as grass leaves, were shaped using the flake and blade technique, a method often associated with faraway cultures in Europe, but already present in Southeast Asia long before. In the Malay Peninsula and Borneo, tools made from polished wood, barbed spearheads, and small axes with carved grips show precise adaptation to every available material. They did not create tools for display. They crafted them to solve problems, to use their environment with remarkable efficiency. Beyond tools, their environmental knowledge went far beyond mere instinct. They knew which soils softened with rain and which hardened under prolonged sun. They listened to the wind to sense the movement of herds. They detected beehives by the faintest buzzing in the late afternoon forest. In the dry season, they could find pockets of water by reading the pattern of grasses. Such knowledge was not accidental. It had been shaped across generations, a form of prehistoric oral science. There is evidence that Sunda's inhabitants practiced resource management techniques we rarely associate with such ancient times. Controlled burning of grasslands to create clearings that attracted large animals, an early form of landscape fire management, may have begun here tens of thousands of years ago. Some sediment cores from Java and Borneo show sudden spikes in charcoal levels even when climate data indicates no natural fires. This opens the possibility that humans used fire as a deliberate tool, shaping the land to form hunting corridors that were easier to navigate. Their daily lives also reveal subtle technical skill. Bones carved into small needles, only a few centimeters long, suggest they did not simply wrap themselves in unshaped hides, but may have sewn layered garments that resisted rain and nighttime dew. Shell beads drilled with evenly spaced holes, found in Malaysia and Indonesia, point to the presence of ornamentation, a symbolic behavior beyond survival. Whenever humans decorate their bodies, it marks abstract thinking, self-awareness, and a society entering deeper cultural layers. Yet perhaps the most thought-provoking aspect lies in how they organized their groups and divided roles. Though they had no permanent villages, their sense of community was unmistakably strong. Burial evidence shows that they laid their dead in fetal positions, almost as if sleeping, sometimes placing small objects beside them. Without writing, they could not explain their beliefs, but their burials reveal a quiet conviction that death was not an endpoint, but a return, or a journey requiring care. During hunts, they coordinated with skill honed across generations. Trackers led the way, reading the earth like a book. The drive group spread wide across the grassland. Others hid along brush lines, awaiting the moment to strike. These techniques were not instinctual. They came from practice, teaching, and memory. When we look at clean-cut marks on ancient animal bones, we see that their craftsmanship rivaled any hunter-gatherer society on Earth at the time. But the clearest sign of their advancement lies in their ability to endure long-term environmental change. They built no monumental structures, but they built knowledge. They hoarded no grain in storehouses, but they preserved memory within their communities. They did not create civilization in the classical sense, but they created a cultural, linguistic, and genetic foundation that still lives in the people of Southeast Asia today. And from this foundation of subtle, resilient communities, the next question naturally arises. Did they only live scattered along rivers and plains? Or were there larger settlement zones, early villages, hinting at a more stable way of life before the rising seas began to swallow the continent? As the hunter-gatherer communities of Sunda come into view, far more sophisticated than the simplified image we often impose on prehistory, we begin to realize that their seasonal movements were not aimless at all. Across the confluence of ancient rivers and the grasslands weaving through deep forests, there were places humans returned to year after year, until the soil beneath their feet accumulated thick layers of ash, like an unwritten diary of their passage. Over time, this repetition ceased to be coincidence. It became habit, and habit is the first step toward settlement. Near the great rivers, the same rivers that once shaped Sunda's superplain, early humans built camps on high mounds, safe from monsoon floods. These places were not chosen by chance. They offered fresh water, steady fish runs, grassland corridors where large animals passed, and forest edges rich with fruit, tubers, and small game. When archaeologists sampled sediments beneath the Java Sea or the South China Sea, they found tiny layers of charcoal arranged like slow breathing, evidence that people had come, gone, and returned with the turning of familiar seasons. At this stage, the riverside settlements of Sunda did not resemble later agricultural villages. There were no fences, no permanent foundations. But the repeated layout, a hearth at the center, tool-making areas around the edges, sleeping spaces arranged in a gentle arc, reveals a structure both simple and subtle. Some camps lasted centuries, not because a single community stayed, but because many generations returned to the same place, as if the land itself had become an anchor in collective memory. What makes these settlements even more intriguing is the presence of pre-agricultural behavior, not true farming, yet no longer pure foraging. In ancient soils around the Sunda River system, researchers found seeds of wild plants that would later become domesticated, legumes, aroids, and starch residues on stone tools, showing deliberate processing of tubers and roots. They may not have planted crops, but they knew where certain plants thrived and returned at the right season. When harvesting, they often left part of the root in the ground, unintentionally encouraging the plants to spread. They did not call this cultivation, but they understood the rules: moist soil after rain, sunlight opening through the canopy, nutrient-rich silt after the flood season. These small observations, repeated across generations, became the quiet foundation for the domestication of Southeast Asian crops thousands of years later. Only with the arrival of the Holocene, when the climate warmed and the sea rose, did humans shift fully to agriculture. Yet the earliest seeds of that knowledge may have sprouted on lands now deep underwater. Alongside plants, many settlement sites reveal signs of social stability. The fact that multiple groups use the same places over generations suggests the existence of soft agreements about land use. One group left, another arrived, and without conflict, they respected the site as shared ground. This implies that Sunda's inhabitants lived by unwritten laws, not recorded in symbols, but preserved in land use patterns, footpaths, and the simple act of returning to the same place season after season. These camps were also hubs of exchange. Stone tools found along the Vietnamese coast contain rock types originating in Malaysia, meaning that travel routes were not merely paths of survival, but channels for trading materials, knowledge, and technique. Riverside settlements acted as crossroads, places where tools were swapped, languages brushed against each other, and skills quietly spread. Yet the deepest connection was with water. Ancient Sunda people followed rivers not only for food. Rivers were their maps. Rivers guided them when lost in the forest, signaled when fish were abundant, and showed them the safest places to camp: a gentle bend, a bank that never eroded, a slope leading easily to the water. Such spots became temporary centers where people gathered, exchanged, and formed quiet bonds. But the more we understand their riverside life, the more clearly we sense that they lived at a crossroads, between stability and uncertainty, between repetition and change. At the time, they could not have known that their familiar world, the sand where children played, the water bank where women washed wild roots, the mound where fires glowed at night, would not last forever. A slow shift was already underway, almost invisible day by day but relentless, arriving from the melting of distant ice, from delicate atmospheric adjustments, from the first centimeters of rising water that whispered of a future utterly unlike their past. As the riverside settlements of Sunda become more familiar, with hearths rekindled across generations and high earthen mounds growing into natural landmarks, a new perspective begins to unfold. These people did not live in isolation. Even without villages, maps, or fixed paths, they wove a vast network of movement far more intricate than archaeology once imagined. Trade did not resemble the exchange of goods in classical civilizations. Instead, it appeared through the sharing of knowledge, materials, and stories, things light as breath, yet powerful enough to form the cultural currents of an entire continent. It is difficult to grasp the sheer scale of Sunda if we rely only on today's maps. But before the seas rose, the land that connected Vietnam, Malaysia, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo was not a collection of scattered islands. It was a continuous expanse so wide that humans could cross it in weeks or months, depending on the season and the trail of food. When people were few and the world was open, Long-distance travel was not unusual. It was a natural instinct for communities that depended on rivers, herds, and water cycles for survival. This created natural routes of movement, along great rivers, across the edges of grasslands, through low mountain passes, and linked by temporary camps where fires burned through the night. They never set out to build a network, yet each time someone paused, traded a flint shard, or left behind a broken spearhead, they quietly expanded the shared map of their world. Knowledge did not belong to individuals. It belonged to the flow of people. One of the clearest pieces of evidence comes from stone tools. Certain stones found in Sumatra trace their geological origins to the highlands of Cambodia. Volcanic flakes discovered in Borneo share composition with rock from the Malay Peninsula. These stones did not move on their own. They traveled through many hands, across many seasons of hunting, through countless encounters along riverbanks. They are silent witnesses to the movement of materials, and with materials came stories. When a group arrived at a familiar waterbend, they never knew who might appear that night, but they knew the place did not belong only to them. Perhaps they found a discarded spear tip, or a woven basket with a broken strap, or a blade design unlike their own. These small signs were messages. Someone passed through here, and life continues in lands you have not seen. It was an invisible network, coordinated by no one, but carried by everyone. Within this network, the river routes were the strongest. Sunda's great rivers carried more than water and silt. They carried memory. By following a river, a group could traverse half the continent without losing their way. And because other groups followed the same currents, encounters happened naturally. In these meetings, they exchanged tools, shared news of migrating herds, and sometimes forged marriage ties, spreading genetic diversity across time. But there were also quieter routes, forest corridors. Not the impenetrable jungle we imagine today, but natural passageways where sunlight pierced the canopy just enough for large animals to pass. Humans followed the animals, and the animals followed food. No one led the way, yet everyone knew the way. What made this trade network unique was its softness. There were no merchants, yet materials moved. There was no concept of value, yet exchange happened. There was no complex social machinery, yet the shared use of space remained stable. This softness created a cultural continuity, explaining why groups across Sunda, though separated by hundreds of kilometers, used similar tools, decorated shells in the same patterns, and buried their dead with comparable rituals. From this network came something even more important. Knowledge traveled faster than people. A new blade-sharpening technique could spread from what is now central Vietnam to the edges of Java in just a few generations. Without writing, without messengers, knowledge flowed like water, pooling where it found low ground, moving onward where it found height. Yet no matter how stable this network was, it could not withstand the greatest force of the age, climate. As ice melted at the poles, as rivers rose slowly yet steadily, as lowlands filled with creeping water, familiar routes began to shift. Shallow riverbanks became deep pools, wide grasslands turned to marsh, high mounds transformed into small islands, and so the trade network of an entire continent was forced to reshape itself, even as humans failed to recognize that the world beneath their feet was already changing. From here, the story moves in a new direction. If such a vast and enduring mobility system once existed, then as the seas rose, how did these communities respond? Did they retreat, adapt, or fade with the land they once called home? As the mobility network of Sunda's people expanded, like a soft web stretched across the continent, where great rivers merged into lifelines nourishing the land, a natural question begins to rise. When they sat around their fires at night, what did they believe? Humans did not live on meat, fish, or forest fruit alone. They lived on the meanings they wove into the world, on the sense that behind nature's shifting patterns lay a force greater than themselves, something unseen, yet felt in every shift of the wind, every late coming rain, every animal cry echoing from the dark edge of the forest. At night, when firelight flickered across the nameless plain, their shadows stretched over dry ground, and the sky above opened without limit. No streetlights, no haze, no glow of distant cities, only thousands of stars shining so clearly that it must have felt as if one could reach up and touch them. That experience carried more than simple beauty. It was the beginning of belief, the idea that above them lay another realm, wider, more orderly, but revealed only to those who lingered in the darkness long enough to notice. Hunter-gatherer societies everywhere formed bonds with land and forest, but the people of Sunda held an even deeper bond with water. Water, from rivers, from rain, from marshes, from the distant sea, was the heart of their world. When an ancient Sunda person stepped into the river at dusk, feeling the coolness rise around their ankles, they did not simply feel water. They felt the presence that had fed them, guided them, and at times taken those they loved. Water was more than substance. It was memory, a thread tying them to generations before. In many hunter-gatherer cultures, water is the dwelling place of ancestors, and perhaps Sunda was no different. Cave sites along the edges of the old continent, in Borneo, Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula, hold layers of charcoal and faint drawings. They are not bold or detailed like the cave art of Europe, but they still speak. Negative handprints, charcoal curves, scattered red dots, all suggest that the people of Sunda looked at cave ceilings as a kind of book, a way to preserve something that speech or gesture alone could not hold. Perhaps warnings, perhaps records of game, perhaps rituals for the dead. Art at this time wasn't decoration, it was remembrance. Burial sites across the region deepen this picture. Many bodies were laid to rest in curled, sleeping positions, heads pointed toward water, as if they believed that after closing their eyes, the deceased would continue following the river toward another place. Some graves held shells or small tools, simple objects, yet rich in meaning. Not luxuries, farewells. Signs of a belief in continuity, in a journey beyond death. Quiet, but unmistakable. Perhaps the most subtle part of their belief system was how they saw nature as a living presence. The monsoon winds were not just physics, they were signals. The turning of herds was not mere instinct, it was a message. Early rains or late rains, each carried a meaning. These people lived slowly enough to perceive nature's smallest rhythms. That respect formed the root of belief. No stone monuments, no temples, no sacrifices. Belief lived in breath. At several Sunda shelf sites, researchers have found clusters of stones, arranged in small circles or half circles. They may have been simple hearths, but it is also possible, according to a thoughtful, non-radical hypothesis, that they were used in early rituals. A ring of stones on a high mound may have been where people gathered for a birth, or where they mourned a death. The evidence is not strong enough for certainty, yet the repeated appearance of these structures suggests they carried meaning deeper than everyday use. From these scattered traces, a deeper reflection emerges. Did the ancient people of Sunda, between forest and grassland, develop a spiritual life far richer than we usually assign to this era? Did living beside rivers, beneath open skies, and inside the weaving of monsoon seasons inspire them to form a philosophy, not in words, but in feeling, about humanity's place within nature? No one can answer with certainty. But the traces that remain tell us one truth. The people of Sunda did not merely live on the land, they lived with it. They did not simply pass through time, they carried time with them. As we reach the spiritual life of ancient Sunda's people, those nights they looked up at a sky full of stars and sensed nature as a living presence. The story naturally leads us into another layer, the creatures who moved through the ages alongside them. If humans were the witnesses of a continent almost too vast to imagine, then the megafauna, the great beasts of the land, were their silent companions. In those days, across deep forests and open grasslands, the footprints of giant animals dotted the earth like nature's exclamation marks, as if the land and its creatures were writing the same story together. The Sunda shelf of that era was not a magnified version of modern Southeast Asia. It was a different world entirely. Tropical forests stretched unbroken from the mainland across regions now submerged beneath the sea. On the open plains, ancient elephants traveled in herds, larger and stronger than any living descendants today. At dawn, the deep tremor of their footsteps must have rolled across the landscape, a sound the people of Sunda knew as familiarly as we know the noise of cities in the morning. Beside the elephants roamed the ancient Javan tiger, larger, freer, and the absolute apex predator of the land. With forest and grassland forming a single connected expanse, without cliffs or seas to divide them, their range stretched from the Mekong region all the way to Java and Sumatra. For the people of Sunda, the tiger was more than an animal. It was the line between life and death. A single bite mark on an ancient bone tells us one truth. Humans and tigers shared the same world, hunted the same plains, and sometimes faced each other in moments lost to history. Great herds of Banteng cattle roamed as well, their crescent-shaped horns glinting like new moons. To Sunda's people, Banteng were both livelihood and challenge. Many stone spear points found along the Sunda shelf show characteristic fractures from striking the thick hide of large animals, proof that these communities did not hunt only small prey. They engaged megafauna with strategies requiring skill, timing, and coordinated teamwork. In the dim edges of the forest, tapirs moved like round shadows through the night. Their footprints in the mud told the Sunda people much. Tapirs preferred clean water, predictable trails, knowledge that helped humans choose paths and place traps exactly where they needed to be. Along the ancient mangroves and coastal wetlands, saltwater crocodiles, giant turtles, and countless waterbirds formed an ecosystem so abundant it is almost overwhelming to imagine. Before the sea reclaimed the Sunda Plain, many areas of what is now the Java Sea were vast marshlands. There, catfish, eels, and bream swam in large schools, reliable food sources that required only the right season to gather. What made the Sunda fauna truly remarkable was its position at an evolutionary crossroads. To the west lay the life of continental Asia: tigers, elephants, wild cattle, boars. To the east, near the Wallace Line, came the breath of Australia: tree kangaroos, cassowaries, marsupials. Sunda was a natural laboratory where two worlds met, mingled, and produced a biodiversity unmatched anywhere on Earth at the time. The people of Sunda did not see these animals solely as prey. Each species carried meaning. A herd of deer changing direction signaled rain. Flocks of waterbirds foreshadowed rising water. The absence of tigers for several days could signal the arrival of other predators. In that world, animals did not merely live beside humans. They communicated with them through movement, sound, and presence. When we look at the fragments that remain of Sunda's megafauna, we glimpse a world so alive it seems almost unreal. A place where humans did not dominate, did not stand at the top, but instead wove themselves into a larger network, where every species held its place, its role, its rhythm in the continent's shared song. And it was that rhythm that would be tested as the climate shifted. As water rose slowly but steadily, as forests fragmented into islands of greenery, as grasslands shrank piece by piece, the megafauna were forced to retreat or disappear. These changes were not confined to animals. They struck directly at human life, reshaping how people hunted, how they built camps, and even the memories they passed down beside their fires. From here, the story turns toward a decisive question. As the seas rose and this once expansive world dissolved, how did the people of Sunda respond? Did they retreat, adapt, or vanish along with the continent that had carried them for tens of thousands of years? As the animal world of Sunda emerges like a vast mirror, reflecting the richness and intensity of nature, we begin to see the early culture of the people who lived within that landscape more clearly. Culture, in their world, did not appear in a sudden leap. It did not arise from cities or agriculture. It was born from the continuous relationship between humans and the land, the rainforest, the grasslands, the rivers, the wetlands, and the night sky pouring with stars like a river of light. When the great continent had not yet been divided by the sea, the culture of Sunda's people was not a single block. It flowed like a soft current, weaving through fire camps, seasonal settlements, and the quiet paths their feet repeated for thousands of years. What made this cultural landscape remarkable was the intersection of many different environments. In the deep forests, where sunlight fell only in thin fragments, people developed knowledge of trees, roots, and fungi. Tools found in the ancient forests of Borneo show they knew how to smooth wood, make fishing rods, and turn bark into mats or containers. This knowledge required no writing, yet it persisted stubbornly in communal memory, passed through stories, demonstrations, and the quiet observation of children following elders through the trees. Across the open grasslands, where light stretched to the horizon, culture revolved around the rhythm of large hunts. Stone spear points, sometimes thin and leaf-shaped, sometimes wide for deeper wounds, reveal the diversity of their techniques. At several ancient camps now submerged beneath the South China Sea, researchers found small tool caches, raw stone in one corner, broken flakes in another, finished tools placed near the hearth. They had no concept of workshops, yet the regularity of production suggests something very close. One can almost imagine them sitting beneath the pale afternoon light, patiently chipping each blow to prepare blades for the upcoming season. The freshwater marshes nurtured a different way of living. Here, culture was inseparable from water. Fish traps, shell gathering, and sometimes turning those very shells into ornaments. Strikingly, drilled shells from many different locations show nearly identical hole sizes and drilling techniques. This tells us Sunda's people did not make objects only for utility. They made them for aesthetic purposes, for the desire to say something about themselves to others. Art, in its most humble form, had already begun. And when we look broadly, from Vietnam to Sumatra, we see similar patterns of body ornamentation. Tiny drilled holes in bone, polished stone flakes used as simple mirrors, beads strung on forest fibers. This cannot be coincidence. It reflects a seamless cultural network, sustained not by walls or roads, but by the continuous movement of people. In the caves that once sat along the continent's ancient edges, Liang Bua, Naya, the coastal caves of Sumatra, we see traces of a rhythmic way of life. The fire in one position, the tool-making zone nearby, the sleeping area in the driest corner. These arrangements repeat across millennia, as though culture itself was habit turning into memory. Early belief left marks as well. Choosing burial sites near water, placing small objects beside the dead, leaving open space around hearths, all reflect a sensitivity to things beyond explanation. There were no priests, no temples, no scriptures, but they held a deep sense of connection. The land carried intention, water carried meaning, winds brought messages, large animals bore signs. This intuitive worldview became a natural ethic. Hunt only when needed, gather only what is enough, always leave space for the next season, as if they believed the land itself needed to breathe. Language, though long dissolved in the foam of time, must have existed vibrantly. There could not have been shared materials or wide mobility without communication. And because Sunda was vast, it likely hosted many early branches of pre-Austronesian, pre-Austroasiatic, and other lost tongues. Each great river basin served as a mixing ground, farther regions as points of linguistic branching. Culture never stood still. It shifted with water, with herds, with seasons. For thousands of years, Sunda's culture was stable, yet never static. Each generation adjusted its way of living to the rains, the animals, the rivers. Yet the root remained a deep harmony with the landscape. A harmony that felt enduring, but was fragile before a force greater than any community could comprehend: the quiet, growing change of climate. When the first signs appeared, rivers turning murkier at the end of the dry season, fish moving to higher waters, sand banks flooding earlier each year, the people of Sunda could not yet know they were hearing the first whispered warnings of an enormous transformation. A transformation that would alter not only the land beneath them, but carry away the delicate, profound culture they had woven over millennia. As the cultural landscape of Sunda's people continued to breathe quietly, steady, gentle, as if the world itself were exhaling, the first changes began to unfold at the edges of their perception. Nature did not warn them with storms or sudden catastrophes. Instead, it shifted through signs so subtle that perhaps no one gave them much thought. A puddle that lingered longer after the rains, a riverbank that never fully dried, despite weeks of sun, a flock of water birds choosing a different path from the year before. To the people of Sunda, these were likely just small variations in weather. They could not have known these were the earliest tremors of a transformation that would eventually sweep away the entire world beneath their feet. Around 14,600 years ago, Earth began to emerge from the last ice age. The massive ice sheets of the northern hemisphere, silent, unmoving for tens of thousands of years, began to crack, shift, and break into colossal fragments. That sound never reached Sunda, but the consequences reached every inch of their land. Meltwater poured into the oceans in such volume that global sea levels rose faster than at any time humans had ever witnessed. Scientists now call this event Meltwater Pulse 1A, a period when the sea may have risen more than 20 meters in just a few centuries, a number far beyond the intuition of anyone living at the time. To Sunda's people, it all began as small changes. The river stood slightly higher. The sandbars where they built seasonal camps held moisture even during the dry months. When they returned the next year, the riverbank had shifted again, something they had always known as a wandering river. Yet this time the change wasn't driven by the flow. It was driven by the sea. The ocean was rising from far away, pushing fresh water inland, with a force so gentle it never paused, never reversed. Around 13,000 years ago, when the climate abruptly cooled again during the Younger Dryas, they may have felt the wind behave differently, the rain fall off rhythm. Yet the sea continued to climb. And when the Younger Dryas ended, about 11,700 years ago, Earth entered a period of steady warming. Sea levels, already high, began to rise even faster. Forests near the rivers flooded earlier each year, forcing animals to change their migration routes. Familiar hunting grounds disappeared within just a few generations. In the lowlands, especially the regions that are now the South China Sea and the Java Sea, water began claiming small pieces of land, then linking those pieces into great sheets of standing flood. The ancient people of Sunda almost certainly did not realize they were losing a plain larger than the Nile Valley. In their experience, there was simply a little more water. But as that little more repeated itself generation after generation, the familiar shoreline had crept kilometers inland, a shift too slow for individuals to perceive, yet unstoppable in its progression. Each passing season brought more quiet change. Post-rain pools no longer drained completely. Flooded hollows extended farther. Abandoned river channels curved across the landscape like fading lines of memory. Groups that once camped on high mounds had to move to higher ones still. They did not know they were leaving behind their invisible villages, places layered with the ash of countless hearths, places where lifetimes had passed and settled silently into the soil. As lowlands transformed into wide lakes, megafauna began retreating into narrower corridors. This increased the pressure on food resources and fractured the delicate balance between humans and animals. Ancient elephants left the valleys. Banteng herds changed direction. Large deer no longer gathered in the open fields they once favored. And as the animals changed their routes, humans were forced to change theirs as well. Trade paths that had endured for millennia were suddenly disrupted. Familiar river highways now lay beneath meters of brackish water. Meanwhile, in the higher regions of the continent, a few groups may have begun seeing the larger picture. From mountain slopes in Borneo, they might have watched the land that once reached toward the horizon shimmering now with water. From Sunda's northern highlands, a newly forming coastline widened each year, swallowing ancient valleys as though they had never belonged to the land at all. Yet even as the transformation grew immense, there is no sign these people panicked. They adapted as they always had, shifting their camps, adjusting their routes, following smaller rivers, moving deeper into higher forests. That flexibility is the reason their descendants are still alive today. But no form of adaptation could ever shift the deeper law of Earth. When ice melts, the sea rises, and when the sea rises, the plains disappear. The Sunda continent, vast beyond modern imagination, had already begun its irreversible descent. As the sea rose, inch by inch each year, the change arrived without thunder or warning. From that moment on, the earliest losses of Sunda unfolded like the slow breath of the earth, quiet, steady, and impossible to resist. The people living on that great continent did not know they were witnessing one of the largest geological events of their age. They saw only small shifts, low-lying hollows holding water longer than before, riverbanks that refused to dry even under long stretches of sun. The disappearance of an entire landmass began with changes so subtle that even those living upon it could not sense they were standing at the beginning of an end. The lowest regions of the Sunda Shelf, what is now the floor of the South China Sea and the Java Sea, were the first to sink. At first, only a thin sheet of water covered the grasslands, where large animals had once come to drink in the afternoon. But the next year, that thin layer no longer receded fully. It thickened, spread, and crept into places where only a few days of sun had once been enough to dry the soil. And 10 years later, when a younger generation stood where their parents once stood, they saw only a flat, quiet mirror of water. No crashing sounds, no dramatic collapse, only land retreating beneath their feet. Geological evidence shows that between 14,000 and 12,000 years ago, rising seas swallowed tens of thousands of square kilometers each century. But the decisive period occurred between 11,500 and about 8,000 years ago, when global sea levels rose so quickly that large portions of Sunda vanished within just a few generations. A blink in the timeline of Earth, but a monumental upheaval for human life. Yet for the people of Sunda, even this immense change arrived in silence. There was never a single moment when they could have said, "The continent is gone." Instead, it disappeared piece by piece, breath by breath, like a story erased page by page before anyone realized the entire book was changing. The first places to go were the confluence zones of the great Sunda River system, the same areas where their fires had burned season after season for millennia. The high mounds where they once waited out the monsoons now rose like small, lonely islands. As these islands grew fewer, they moved away from the ancestral grounds, layered with the ashes of generations. They did not flee in panic. They left because the water had spoken. This land is no longer meant for people. Then the grassland corridors, the routes where banteng and ancient elephants had once passed, began to lose their sunlight. Water filled the open fields, turning them into shallow, unsettled lakes, then into large wetlands. As the herds shifted direction, humans followed. The hunting paths that had shaped their seasonal rhythms for thousands of years disappeared beneath a young, sediment-filled sea. This did more than reduce food supplies. It broke a balance that had held for generations. Soon after, even the major rivers, the natural highways of the continent, began to change shape. Salt water pushed inland, bending the flow, preventing silt from settling the way it once had. Freshwater fish retreated to higher ground. The landing spots where groups met, traded tools, and exchanged stories turned into brackish water, then into shallow sea, then disappeared entirely beneath the blue. When the rivers changed course, they did not only lose habitat, they lost the very network that connected them to one another. The low rainforests near the ancient coast, now far beneath the Java Sea, shared the same fate. These forests had once provided honey, roots, fungi, wood, and shaded pathways strong enough to guide people through the heat. As water claimed the forest, humans moved deeper inland or up the surrounding hills. Riverine camps vanished without a trace. Burial sites, once sacred with memory and grief, sank quietly beneath salt water. Yet perhaps the most symbolic change was the breaking apart of the land itself. A region once continuous, a place where ancient humans could walk from Vietnam all the way to Borneo, was now pulled into pieces, then fragments. Peninsulas narrowed into strips, strips transformed into islands. Each time the sea rose a few more meters, a familiar path was erased from the invisible map in people's minds. A meeting route between two groups vanished. A story once shared across a river could now only stay on one side. Division was not just geography, it was the breaking of memory. Water rose from three directions: the Indian Ocean to the west, the Pacific to the east, and the growing sea around Java to the south. Sunda was caught between three expanding bodies of water, a situation no prehistoric population had ever faced at such a scale. By around 8,000 to 7,000 years ago, most of the Sunda plain had drowned completely. What remained were the major landmasses we know today: Sumatra, Java, Borneo, the Malay Peninsula. Everything else, the land that once bound them, now lies beneath a deep, blue silence, where sunlight reaches only the first layer of sediment. But the story does not end when the land sinks. Because people do not sink with the land, they moved, they adapted. They carried the memory of that lost continent with them, in their languages, in their techniques, in their traditions, and in their blood. As the sea began to swallow the lowlands of Sunda, hill by hill, meadow by meadow, river bend by river bend, humans found themselves facing a reality no ancestral memory had ever prepared them for. They did not leave their homeland because of war or scarcity, but because the ground beneath their feet was no longer ground at all. The forced migration did not arrive as panic. It rose like small ripples repeating each year, pushing them back step by step. And within just a few generations, those steps turned into a journey with no way back. What was strange was how slow the change felt to a single lifetime, yet how rapid it was for an entire culture. A child born just as water began creeping into the lowlands would, by old age, find their childhood playground lying beneath a shallow sea. The next generation, standing on the same horizon, would see only calm water, never knowing that beneath that blue surface had once been forests, plains, hunting grounds, and camps that had burned through thousands of seasons. The memory of a vast land slowly became a story told in a soft voice beside the fire. The story of a world they would never see again. Their migrations unfolded along three main directions, and each path carried a piece of Sunda's identity. Over time, these paths would form the foundations of three major cultural lineages in Southeast Asia. The first direction, north and northeast, toward mountains and highlands. Groups living near what is now the South China Sea moved northward, along the low mountain chains of Vietnam and Cambodia. As familiar rivers turned into salty bays, they searched for new ones. The Mekong, with its countless branches and high banks, became a natural migration corridor. Many groups climbed into upland terraces where water had not yet reached. From these people, early Proto-Austroasiatic branches may have emerged, carrying with them the memory of a great plain that no longer existed. The second direction, westward, along the hill ridges of the Malay Peninsula. Communities living on the western flank of the continent, the region once connecting Sumatra, Malaysia, Thailand, followed the slopes of hills to avoid the flooding basins. As the low grasslands vanished, they moved through higher forest clearings. These groups carried with them sharp-edged stone tools, drilled shell ornaments, and distinctive riverside camp structures. Many caves in the Malay Peninsula still hold their traces today. Flakes of stone, fragments of bone, or charcoal from a fire that burned tens of thousands of years ago. The third direction, south and southeast, reopening the ancient route toward Malaysia and Australia. As the southern portions of Sunda sank fastest, some groups did not move upward, but downward, into the chain of islands not yet fully separated. Java, then Flores, then into the archipelago of Wallacea. This was the same route that had once led to Australia tens of thousands of years earlier. They traveled not only for food, but also because migration was already part of their ancestral memory, a pathway preserved through oral tradition long before their own time. Remarkably, throughout this immense reshaping of their world, there is no sign of chaos, no great wars, no violent collapse, no desperate mass flight as we often imagine when thinking of sunken lands. The people of Sunda moved the way they had always lived, following the herds, following the monsoon, following the water. Except this time, the movement had become destiny. Their softness, their slowness, and their steady persistence are the very reasons their descendants still survive today. As they dispersed, their culture branched as well. Languages shifted from valley to valley and river to river. Habits changed with each new landscape. Stone tools, once unified across a vast plain, diversified according to region. But beneath all differences lay a quiet thread holding them together. The memory of Sunda. The way they shaped a stone edge, the way they drilled shells, the way they built camps beside water, and the belief that water carried the spirits of their ancestors. What is extraordinary is that this ancient branching still shows up today, not only in artifacts, but in the bodies of modern people. Genetic studies reveal that populations across Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia, and beyond share the imprint of a common ancestor, a signature of the great human corridor that once stretched across Sunda before the continent disappeared. That land, though drowned beneath the sea, still lives in millions today. And then, once their migration paths had formed, once the highlands became new homes, the people of Sunda entered the final phase of a process that had lasted thousands of years: the complete disappearance of the ancient plain beneath the rising sea. At this point, the question is no longer, where did they go? But rather, beneath the deep water, what did Sunda leave behind? What traces still remain to tell the story of a lost continent? When the forced migrations pushed the people of Sunda onto higher ground, it felt as if the story had nearly come full circle. People leaving, land sinking, memories scattering with their footsteps. But in truth, the deepest part of the story begins here. The very communities that once lived at the water's edge, where the Great Plain met the ancient sea, were the first to disappear, and they are also the ones who left behind the fewest traces. When the water rose, they felt the change first in their sleeping places, their fishing spots, the paths they walked each day. Yet because they left the earliest, the memories they carried were the first to fade from history. What makes these coastal communities the greatest blind spot of modern archaeology comes down to three converging factors: low elevation, rapid submergence, and the fragile nature of their material culture. Most coastal camps sat only a few meters above the old shoreline. So when the sea began to rise, those places flooded almost immediately. The shoreline may have advanced only a few hundred meters per decade, too slow to create panic, but too fast for a camp to survive more than a generation. 10 years could turn a sleeping ground into a shallow pool, a few more decades into a tidal bay. One more lifetime, and it became part of the ocean floor. They did not build stone houses. They raised no pillars. They left no structures that could resist salt and wind. Their tools and shelters, bamboo baskets, wooden rafts, palm leaf roofs, were things the sea needed only a few years to erase. Even their stone tools, the most durable part of their world, were no match for currents and shifting mud. They were buried, swept aside, or hidden beneath thick layers of silt. And so the irony emerges. The most vibrant, prosperous, interconnected places, the ones closest to the sea, became the emptiest places in the archaeological record. During meltwater pulse 1b around 11,000 years ago, sea levels rose so quickly that entire coastal regions vanished within a few centuries, too fast for cultures to adapt, too slow for any single person to grasp the scale of loss. Fishing grounds once set with stone traps became shallow seas. Mangrove forests, crucial for food and shelter, turned into brackish stretches of open water. And the lowlands where they buried their dead were erased, leaving behind only thin layers of silt, now resting beneath 40 to 70 meters of water. For 21st century archaeologists, the first barrier is not the question of where they lived, but the depth at which they now rest. Much of the Sunda Shelf lies at depths that light cannot reach, where underwater currents churn sediments endlessly, and where survey instruments face their limits. A single chipped stone, a drilled shell bead, a smear of charcoal. A few thousand years is enough to bury them under meters of mud. The challenge is not simply technological. It lies in the nature of the past itself. These people left no lasting structures. They built no temples, no walls, no floors. They lived season to season, camped briefly, and moved on. Their culture lived in habits, a fire ring, a raised mound, a footprint, things the sea could erase in a single cycle. And there is something subtler still. Coastal societies are often the most innovative. Those who lived along the water had the most contact with changing tides, with travelers from distant islands, with food sources unknown inland. They tested new nets, new tools, new ways of arranging stones to trap fish, new social rhythms suited to shifting shorelines. Their dynamism made them a crucial part of Sunda's cultural evolution, but it also made them the easiest to erase. Their lifeways changed rapidly, and the sea swallowed their records just as quickly. Occasionally, in sediment cores taken from the floor of the South China Sea, scientists find a thin band of charcoal, not from a forest fire, but from a small hearth. Yet around it, there is nothing else. No tools, no bones, no signs of camp life. It feels like a single memory drifting through millennia, settling quietly on the seabed, waiting to be found. These fragments, a faint whisper of what once was, are all we have of the shoreline communities that vanished before they could leave a footprint on higher ground. What remains is not a set of objects, but a question. Are we looking at an absence in history, or a form of presence we are not yet able to perceive? These coastal groups may have shaped early language, maritime knowledge, even the way later peoples understood water itself. But their traces lie beneath murky depths, where the Sunda shelf guards its stories without a sound. And yet, they did not disappear from the world. Their genes live on in millions of people today. Ancient syllables in Austroasiatic and Austronesian languages may still carry echoes of their speech. Customs like building camps beside water, burying the dead near flowing currents, or crafting shell ornaments have roots far older than the archaeological surface suggests. Below the silent seabed, pieces of them are still there, not to be seen, but to be understood when the time is right. And that silence leads us to the next chapter of this story. How can modern science follow traces buried beneath 40 to 70 meters of water? When the coastal communities of Sunda slipped quietly off the map, when the material traces of their lives sank beneath layers of deepening silt, it became easy to imagine that their history had been erased. But the truth is far more delicate. What stone, shell, or charcoal cannot hold, memory does. Not through writing or monuments, but through stories carried on breath, shared beside firelight, passed from one generation to the next. As the water rose like the long inhale of the earth itself, they could not record, but they could speak. They spoke to their children, and their children to theirs. Over thousands of years, those spoken memories became mythology, something we often treat as symbolism, though it is sometimes history told in the language of metaphor. Nearly every people who once belonged to the cultural world of Sunda holds a version of the Great Flood story. The strange thing is that these stories appear across Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Papua, and even in some ancient traditions of indigenous Australians. This repetition is not coincidence. It is like pieces of a broken mirror, reflecting the same shared memory, the memory of a drowned continent. In Indonesia, countless ethnic groups tell of a flood so immense that the land became sea. One legend from Sulawesi says their ancestors lived on a vast country where forests touched forests and great animals moved in herds. Then one day, water rose from 4 directions, forcing them to escape up the mountains. When they returned, the sea was already there. Set beside geological data, the story takes on a haunting clarity. Between 8,000 and 7,000 years ago, nearly the entire Sunda shelf sank beneath the ocean. In the Malay Peninsula, the indigenous Negrito peoples say the sea was once so low that the ancestors walked to the place where the sun sets. Then the water rose and separated them into different groups on different islands. A simple image, yet perfectly aligned with paleogeography. One could indeed walk from Malaysia to Borneo, from Vietnam to Java. In Vietnam, ancient legends consistently revolve around two motifs: a powerful sea and the sea pushing inland. Many tales speak of water climbing the mountains, the ocean swallowing the fields, or dragons lifting the waters high. There is no proof these stories directly descend from Sunda, but the deep, persistent anxiety about rising seas, about water invading the land, is a thread that runs through generations. Such images can only come from a memory older than the culture itself. In the Philippines, Visayan peoples say that once the islands were one, and the sea later split people into distant siblings. To them, the island is not the default condition, it is the aftermath. That inversion reflects the exact reality of Sunda. Islands came after, not before. Papuan groups in New Guinea preserve tales of a flood that forced their ancestors into the mountains. When they descended, the new sea had filled every pathway, blocking the route west that once existed. It is a faint echo of the rising waters that remade Melanesia and Sunda alike. Looking deeper, anthropologists notice a remarkable pattern. In much of Southeast Asian mythology, water is not an agent of punishment. It does not rage. It does not destroy out of divine anger. Water simply rises, slowly, steadily, inevitably, exactly the way the people of Sunda witnessed it over millennia. This stands in stark contrast to the flood myths of Mesopotamia, the Hebrew tradition, or Greece, where deluge is divine wrath. In Southeast Asia, the flood is a natural law. They did not see a god's fury, they saw a shift in the world. And because that shift unfolded across many generations, they did not see catastrophe, they saw destiny. This is what gives their mythology its quiet historical weight. It is not dramatic. There is no thunder, no cosmic punishment, no gods reshaping the world overnight. There is only the sea rising, and people climbing to higher ground. Today, when we read these stories with modern eyes, we often treat them as imagination. But once we know that Southeast Asia was once a single, immense landmass, and that it sank slowly for nearly 6,000 years, we see that their myths do not exaggerate. They distill memory. While the material world of Sundaland was swallowed by the sea, the memory of Sundaland lived through stories. Without maps or manuscripts, people still passed down what they had witnessed: the disappearance of land. When the memory of the Great Flood still echoed through myth, when the voices of ancestors survived only as fragments reflecting a world already drowned, modern science began searching for what remained: the silent parts, the material parts, the parts lying beneath 40 to 70 meters of water. From that moment, underwater archaeology stopped being the hunt for shipwrecks or relics of recent centuries. It became an attempt to touch a vanished continent. Each sonar pulse sent toward the seafloor became a small but pointed question. Do the old flood stories mirror the true shape of the ocean beneath? The first thing researchers realized when they surveyed the Sunda Shelf was that the seabed is not flat at all. Beneath what looks like endless blue, the South China Sea and the Java Sea hold ancient valleys, winding riverbeds, and the outlines of lakes that dried up tens of thousands of years ago. You could never see them with the naked eye, but under high-frequency sonar, every contour appears as clearly as ink pressed beneath thin paper. The fossil waterways of a continent that once breathed. One of the most astonishing discoveries is the Sunda River system, the colossal river that once gathered the Mekong, the Rajang, the Baram, the Chao Phraya, and countless other tributaries. It still lies there, preserved in its meandering shape. Even after thousands of years of sediment, the river keeps its low floodplains, its broad bends, and its abandoned oxbow lakes. On a sonar map, it appears like the backbone of the entire lost landmass. And it is not only rivers. Many parts of the seafloor reveal immense valleys, places where ancient elephants, Javan tigers, banteng, and human families once moved with the seasons. Some of these channels are so wide that it feels impossible they sit beneath just a few dozen meters of water. They're like sunken highways, still intact beneath the waves. Then came the sediment cores, long cylinders of earth pulled from 50 to 60 meters deep. Inside them, scientists found layers of fine black charcoal compressed by time, yet carrying the isotopic signature of human fire. Not from wildfires, not from lightning, from hearths. Which means that more than 12,000 years ago, in the exact place where ships pass today across the South China Sea, someone once cooked, warmed themselves, lived. A speck of charcoal the size of a fingernail, enough to reopen the doorway of an entire submerged culture. In the Java Sea, other cores revealed pollen from tropical forest trees, species that never grow in marine conditions. This confirms, with near-perfect clarity, that the seafloor there was once real forest. Birds, mammals, shaded paths, soft earth underfoot, exactly as earlier chapters described. But the most intriguing discoveries have come from underwater LiDAR. When thin bands of laser light scanned the shallow seas around Malaysia and Indonesia, they revealed straight lines and geometric angles, features nature rarely creates by accident. Parallel stone alignments, small crescent-shaped rises, long narrow trenches like the footprints of ancient seasonal pathways. No one dares claim they are artificial, but their regularity makes the question impossible to dismiss. Another layer of evidence comes from the soil itself. In many locations, the earth is sharply divided, a sudden intrusion of salt water above a layer of inland forest soil, and deeper still, the dark organic band where riverside camps once stood. Each sediment layer is a slow-motion film. The era when the forest was dry, the era when humans tended their fires, and the era when the sea swept in and covered everything. Yet Sunda archaeology faces a simple, immovable limit. The ocean moves too much. Strong currents scatter sediment. Storms churn the seafloor. Robots struggle in deep, soft, or shifting terrain. For this reason, much of the central Sunda plain remains a sealed memory, a silent library. Even so, each tiny clue is enough to reconstruct one truth. Sundaland was not a myth. It was real land. Its people were real people. They lived, they traveled, they told stories. And what remains in the sediments is slowly confirming what the old myths once whispered. When the old rivers had become seafloor and the great plain survived only in memory, the people of Sunda found themselves standing before a world they no longer recognized. A world with more water than land, more bays than valleys, more scattered islands, where long corridors of earth once stretched unbroken. From that moment onward, they were no longer the inhabitants of a continent. They became the inhabitants of a newborn coast. And in that subtle shift of geography, something momentous happened. They began to learn the sea. If water had once been only a guide between inland valleys, it was now the road itself. And that transformation didn't come from ambition or technological leaps. It came from necessity. When the great hunting grounds disappeared and the migratory routes of animals broke apart, the people of Sunda were forced to look elsewhere for food. The sea, once distant, now lay at their feet, rich with fish, turtles, clams, crabs, and rhythms they had only partly understood. Archaeological traces across Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula show a clear turning point. Beginning around 8,500 years ago, their diet shifted decisively toward marine life. Deep-sea fish bones, large shell deposits, turtle remains, even bite marks from small sharks began appearing in ancient refuse pits. Such remains could not have come solely from shoreline gathering. They had gone out onto open water in dugout logs, hollowed trunks, bamboo rafts, anything that could float long enough to carry them beyond the shallows. Their seafaring skills were still simple: a hollowed tree trunk, a single paddle, a few bamboo outriggers lashed together for balance. But it was enough to take them beyond the shore, into deeper water, where bigger fish swam, and sometimes across the narrow channels to the next island. Every trip extended their mental map of the ocean a little further. More importantly, they did not fear the sea. For Sunda's people, the ocean was not an intruder. It was simply the new edge of an old world. They had always lived with water, always watched tides, always trusted the logic of rising and falling currents. So when the sea expanded, they did not see an enemy taking land away. They saw a doorway they needed to learn how to cross. Out of that attitude, the earliest hint of an island-based culture began to form, the foundation of what would one day become Austronesian seafaring, a tradition capable of crossing the entire Pacific. From there, life changed quietly but decisively. Camps shifted closer to the shore. Groups that once lived deep in the forest now built shelters near lagoons and young bays. Shells stopped being only ornaments. They became fishhooks, scrapers, cutting tools. On several islands, archaeologists found strange, highly polished grinding stones, evidence that they used salt water to speed up the sharpening of tools. The sea slowly became the center of their culture. Stories of forest hunts began to mix with tales of large fish, nesting turtles, and strong swells. In several myths recorded by 19th century ethnographers, there are references to people who follow the water, groups who traveled along the coast as if the shoreline itself were a kind of road. Different groups began to diverge. Coastal families learned how to organize their camps for salt winds, fire pits shielded by driftwood, sleeping areas lined with broad leaves to keep out sea spray, bamboo hung high to dry so it wouldn't rot. Those living near the hills learned how to shelter from storms, using narrow valleys as windbreaks. These small adaptations became the seeds of later cultural distinctions. One of the clearest markers of this transitional age is the appearance of coarse pottery, something rare before this period. No one knows whether they invented it independently or borrowed the idea from another group, but pottery arrived exactly when they needed containers for boiling water, cooking shellfish, and storing marine foods. The earliest shards from Sumatra, Java, and Borneo carry impressions of woven bamboo and fingerprints, as if baskets were used as molds for wet clay before firing. And soon, short paddles along the coast turned into short crossings, from Sumatra to Malaysia, from Java to Bali, from Borneo to Sulawesi. Sea crossings became routine. No complex navigation, just wind, current, and instinct. And instinct was something the people of Sunda had honed for more than 10,000 years. Researchers now believe these coastal communities laid the earliest stones for Austronesian navigation, a tradition that would eventually carry people to Hawaii, New Zealand, Rapa Nui, and even Madagascar. The continent vanished, but the impulse to move, the old Sundaland instinct, opened an even wider world. But before this story reaches those epic voyages, there is another layer still waiting to be told. The last people of Sunda, the ones who refused to leave, who stayed on the final high ridges, holding on to the last pieces of land not yet claimed by the sea. They watched the ocean rise year by year and chose to remain until the very end. And it was they who carried the last fragments of a continent about to disappear. When most of the people of Sunda had already moved on, when the sea-skilled groups became children of the waves and the hunting clans climbed into the highlands, there were still those who chose to stay. From that moment, it wasn't stubbornness or denial. Not everyone was ready to leave the place where they were born. Some were bound to the forests that had fed them their entire lives. Some believed the water would eventually recede, like every wet season and dry season before it. Some simply didn't know where to go because the very paths their ancestors had walked for thousands of years now lay beneath salt water. In that moment, they did not resist the sea. They simply held onto the land with a quiet, fragile hope that tomorrow might be different. The ones who stayed grew fewer, but their presence, scattered though it was, created one of the most delicate, quiet chapters in Sunda's history. They were not heroes in the way later generations imagine heroes. They were simply people standing at the edge of a world that was ending, unwilling to walk away. And in that quiet endurance, their story became profound. At first, they retreated only a few hundred meters each season. When the water rose, they shifted their camps to a higher ridge. When the low forests flooded, they found shelter under massive old trees. But over generations, that slow retreat ceased to be temporary. Familiar hunting grounds vanished. Old animal trails turned into long, shallow lakes. Hilltops that once stood proudly over the savanna became tiny islands, then disappeared entirely beneath the tide. Between roughly 9,000 and 7,500 years ago came the most painful era of Sunda's existence. The final highlands, the last fragments of a once vast continent, were carved into pieces. Some regions split into chains of small islands. Others were cut twice, then 3 times, by advancing salt water. Still others disappeared within a few generations. Those who remained were literally surrounded. Water from the east, water from the west, water creeping in from the south, as if the continent itself were dissolving beneath their feet. In several archaeological sites on the islands along Sunda's former edge, researchers have found shells, marine fish bones, and hearth remains at elevations that were once inland hills. This means the people climbed to high ridges they had never needed before. It tells a harsh truth: the plains were gone. They clung to the highest ground, the way someone clings to a plank of wood in a flood. Imagine one of their mornings. Before sunrise, the sound of water lapping softly at the base of the hill. From a place that once overlooked a great plain, they now saw a sheet of blue stretching to the horizon. An elder might whisper to a child, "When I was young, the banteng ran there." But the child could not imagine it. The gap between memory and reality was as wide as the water beneath their feet. Then came the cruelest change. Fresh water grew scarce. As the sea pushed inland, groundwater turned brackish. Freshwater pools, the most vital resource, became salty, then disappeared entirely. They dug deeper into the earth, tapped water from tree trunks, relied on survival techniques once used only in dire moments. When nature shifts that completely, no community can stay forever. Yet they didn't leave immediately. Their attachment to the land, to the place where their dead were buried, to the tree that had sheltered them in storms, to the stream that had saved them in lean seasons, kept them there for another year and another. Each year, the sea pressed in a little farther. In sediment cores taken near Java, researchers found the final pollen of a lowland forest species, a species that vanished exactly when the sea reached its new height. That thin layer of pollen is like the forest's final farewell, the last trace of a landscape that had carried the people of Sunda for tens of thousands of years. By about 7,000 years ago, the inevitable happened. The final strips of land broke into tiny islands. What remained could no longer be called a homeland. No rivers, no plains, no forests. Only narrow patches of earth, enough for a few families to build temporary shelters for a short time. And then, they too left. There is no evidence of mass death, no signs of catastrophe. The absence of destruction suggests something else. They left because they understood the land was no longer able to hold them. Perhaps they followed earlier migrants along the new coastlines. Perhaps they crossed narrow channels to nearby islands. Perhaps they moved inland to higher terrain. Whatever direction they chose, they carried the last memories of a drowned world. Memories preserved not in stone, but in people. Those final inhabitants may have been the most important cultural bridge in the prehistory of Southeast Asia. They carried language, techniques, habits, and symbols from a continent lying under the ocean and planted them in new lands. They were the last witnesses, the ones who saw, with their own eyes, the moment when land became sea, not as metaphor, but as reality. When the last inhabitants of the Sunda continent finally left the remaining scraps of land still rising above the water, a new world opened before them. Not the world of deep forests and wide savannas they had known, but a world of curving coastlines, deep blue bays, and narrow strips of sand surrounded entirely by the sea. From that moment on, they were no longer people of the land. They had become people of the shore. In that moment, the sea did more than surround them. It reshaped how they lived, how they moved, and how they remembered themselves. In the first generations after the continent sank, the late Sunda peoples began carrying old knowledge into an entirely new landscape. They still chipped stone tools, still hunted birds, still gathered forest fruits. But they now lived in a world where water had become the primary space of movement. What had once been the center of the continent was now endless water. The old footpaths were gone, and if they wished to survive, they had to find new ways to link island to island. The first boats they built were not sudden inventions. Long before Sunda disappeared, they had used rafts to cross rivers and hollowed logs to cross swamp channels. But when the sea became the only road, those simple tools became the foundation of a maritime tradition taking shape. A single log hollowed deep, 2 bamboo outriggers tied to the sides for balance. This simple form may well have been the distant ancestor of the later outrigger canoe, the iconic vessel of Austronesian sailors. On many islands bordering Old Sunda, archaeology shows a clear shift. Starting around 8,500 years ago, their diet tilted sharply toward marine life. Deep-sea fish bones, large shells, turtle remains, and even small shark teeth began appearing in ancient refuse pits. These could not have come from simple shoreline gathering. They came from journeys offshore, from hollow log boats pushing into deeper water. Yet the most important part was not how far they went, but how they learned to read the sea. After thousands of years living on the continent, they understood the monsoon winds the way one understands the breath of the land. When they moved to the coast, that knowledge became a natural compass. The northeast monsoon, the southwest monsoon, each current of wind carried meaning. They had no maps and no magnetic compass, but they had the sky, the stars, the rhythms of waves, and the inherited memory of seasonal routes. For them, that was enough. The geography helped too. Sunda did not collapse into ocean all at once. It fractured into chains of islands, separated by narrow straits. This allowed them to learn the sea in small steps. One short crossing of a few kilometers prepared them for another. There were no great leaps, only thousands of small journeys, across countless generations, gradually coalescing into skill. Within these post-Sunda communities, new roles slowly appeared. The wind reader, the star watcher, the one who measured depth with a paddle, the one who memorized the outline of islands on the horizon. Some groups built longer, lighter canoes, enough to carry entire families to the next island. Hunting trips evolved into voyages that linked groups, spreading knowledge and widening social networks. Crossing water became normal, not a trial, but a natural part of life. Material traces show the same pattern. Across island Southeast Asia, the earliest pottery shares strikingly similar motifs. Soft, wave-like curves, impressions made with shells or woven bamboo. The repetition is too widespread to be coincidence. It suggests that the late Sunda peoples carried a shared aesthetic and cultural memory across every sea crossing. Soon, a maritime network began to emerge. Short journeys linking Java to Bali, Bali to Lombok, Lombok to Sumbawa. Crossings from Borneo to Palawan. Coastal routes along Vietnam, moving from river mouth to river mouth. These sea paths replaced the river network that had once crisscrossed the great dry plains of ancient Sunda. From this network, researchers believe the late Sunda peoples laid the earliest foundations of the Austronesian expansion, one of the greatest human migrations in history, stretching from Taiwan to the Philippines, through Indonesia, across the Pacific to Hawaii and New Zealand, and even westward to Madagascar. Sunda disappeared as a continent, but its memory survived on the ocean. It lived in the boats, in the monsoon winds, in the night sky, in the stories whispered on calm evenings, when the surface of the sea lay still like a mirror holding the past. And to understand the movement that followed, we must look at a deeper truth. Rising seas did not simply cause migration, they caused branching. Languages branched, techniques branched, cultures branched. And from those branches grew the population map of Southeast Asia as we know it today. When the last Sunda peoples left their drowning homeland and found new footing on the rising chain of Southeast Asian islands, another movement, quieter, slower, yet far more defining than any migration, began to unfold. From that moment on, they were not merely changing where they lived, they were changing how they spoke, how they told stories, how they shaped the rhythm of their days. The great shifts no longer came in waves like the rising sea. They seeped into each generation, into each short sea crossing, into each night by the fire, into each encounter between groups now separated not by forests or rivers, but by the wide breadth of the ocean. Communities once tightly connected across a single continent began drifting along their own cultural paths. Before Sunda sank, many linguists believe this region was once a vast zone of linguistic interweaving, not a single tongue, but a web of related speech. Each group spoke with its own flavor, yet all understood one another well enough to exchange tools, share food, arrange marriages, and tell long stories through the night. But when the waters rose, that continuity broke. Groups who fled into the northern mountains, groups who followed the western forest ridges, and groups who drifted out toward the eastern islands all carried with them their own version of the ancestral language. And over the course of several thousand years, each version grew into a linguistic family. The first family to take recognizable shape was Austroasiatic, the language branch that later spread across Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and parts of Thailand. Many scholars believe that the ancestors of Austroasiatic speakers were once those who lived in the northern reaches of Sunda, directly linked to the ancient Mekong plains. When the sea advanced, they retreated into valleys and uplands, bringing with them memories of the lost lowlands, but also absorbing the rhythms of mountainous life. Their speech shifted slowly, becoming more tonal, more layered, mirroring the steep terrain, the dense forests, and the subtle, attentive way of living in such landscapes. To the east, the groups who drifted toward the islands became the seed of the Austronesian world, one of the largest language families in human history. These future Austronesians carried two gifts inherited from Sunda: the skill of moving across water and a flexible mindset shaped by life in an ever-changing environment. As they traveled to the Philippines, across Indonesia, and eventually as far as Madagascar and the far Pacific, they held on to the habits of their ancestors: camping where water meets land, reading winds like seasons, seeing the sea as the axis of existence. The earliest Austronesian tongue may well have begun among Sunda communities who left the continent while the ocean was still climbing year by year. To the west, another scattering took place: the roots of the Proto-Mon Khmer and Proto-Munda peoples. They lived in a crossroads where deep forests met the sea, where the island world touched the Indian subcontinent. This branch carried a blended spirit: half of the forest, half of the coast. Part hunter-gatherer, part shore forager, following both the tracks of animals and the pull of the tides. This hybridity made them one of the most difficult cultural layers to define, yet also one of the richest in clues. Beyond these major branches, there were smaller voices, linguistic lineages that vanished before they fully emerged. Researchers call them pre-Austronesian, pre-Austroasiatic, or sometimes shadow languages, tongues known only through a few unusual structures or a handful of ancient words scattered across distant islands. Their speakers may have been the last group stranded on shrinking forest ridges, or the people who clung to tiny islands long after the sea had taken nearly everything. They were few, but they may have preserved the most fragile memories of a continent now beneath the waves. Linguistic branching did not simply mirror geographic separation, it reflected spiritual separation. A group living on islands would build a vocabulary for sea, boats, winds, tides. A group living deep in the forest would develop rich words for trees, roots, fungi, the calls of animals. A group surviving in wetlands would name water with precision: fresh water, brackish water, rising water, tidal water. Each environment was a book teaching them how to name the world, and over time, the way they thought changed along with the language they used. The fragmentation of the land also created separate paths of cultural preservation. On the islands, rituals tied to the sea and to ancestors who dwell where the water begins became central. In the forests, rituals of gratitude for trees, animals, and soil took root. Culture diversified along geography, becoming a spiritual network, like the old river network of ancient Sunda, except now the currents flowed through the human mind rather than across the land. And then, when we look at the modern linguistic map, we find something so subtle it borders on eerie. The boundary between Austroasiatic and Austronesian runs almost exactly along the ancient coastline of the Sunda continent. This is no coincidence. It is the shadow of a lost land, still imprinted on how people speak, how they think, how they tell stories today. From this branching, the story now descends into a deeper layer. Sunda did not simply shape the map of humankind. It shaped the map of nature itself, from the plants to the animals, from the forests to the flow of rivers, forming the ecological backbone of Southeast Asia for tens of thousands of years. When the languages and cultures of Southeast Asia began branching after the great sundering of the Sunda continent, a deeper layer of meaning slowly came into view. Even though the sea swallowed nearly all the land, Sunda's legacy did not vanish. It remained, not as a distant memory, but as an invisible network woven into every forest, every river, every species, even into the way land itself is arranged today. From that point on, Sunda was no longer a place. It became an organizing principle for an entire region. Even now, just by looking at a modern map, we can still see the faint outline of a world that once existed. The clearest clues lie in the shapes of the major islands. Sumatra stretches long and narrow, like a continental edge freshly cut from its mother mass. Java lies horizontally, like the rim of an ancient floodplain. Borneo sits rounded and full, the last high shoulder of a land that once connected every direction. These shapes are not accidents. They are the exposed peaks, ridges, and plateaus of the old Sunda landscape. And the waters between them, the South China Sea, the Java Sea, the Strait of Malacca, are not truly seas, but drowned valleys where the mega river systems of Sunda once flowed. This legacy lives not only in landforms, but in the biological web that spans the region, a web science still struggles to fully explain. Why did tigers, elephants, and rhinoceroses once roam as far as Java? Why do banteng, tapirs, and clouded leopards appear in both Malaysia and Borneo? Why does the wildlife of these islands resemble the forests of mainland Asia rather than isolated island ecosystems? The answer lies in Sunda. When it was land, animals moved freely across tens of thousands of years. When the sea rose, each island inherited a fragment of the ancient forest. Plants tell the same story. In Borneo, botanists have found sister species of trees that also grow in Vietnam and Cambodia, even though today they are separated by an entire sea. Tree families like Dipterocarpus, Shorea, and Hopea are distributed as though they are still standing on the same continuous forest floor. This only makes sense under one truth. They once did, on the green expanse of Sunda. Even the rivers of today carry the memory of an older world. The Mekong, the Mahakam, the Kapuas. Their directions and curves still reflect the ancient contours of the submerged continent. Beneath the South China Sea, sonar maps trace the huge, winding trunk of the Sunda Mega River, a massive waterway that once gathered runoff from Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia before emptying into far-off seas. Though now a drowned valley, it still acts as an invisible spine that shapes ocean currents, fishing grounds, and the growth of coral reefs. The South China Sea, wide and seemingly deep, is in truth just a floodplain underwater. Its average depth of 50 to 70 meters is a direct fingerprint of Sunda. That shallowness makes the sea react quickly to monsoon winds, powering storms, driving evaporation, and amplifying temperature contrasts between land and water. Its rich fisheries are no miracle. They are the inheritance of a vanished river delta. Even today's climate, the monsoons, the typhoons, the ocean currents, carries the imprint of Sunda. Monsoon winds strengthened because the newly expanded sea created a larger heat engine. Storms grew more intense because shallow seas trap heat. Each modern typhoon carries an echo of the geographic transformation that happened 10,000 years ago. Sunda's legacy also survives in people themselves. DNA across Southeast Asia carries traces of ancestors who lived in ancient forests, savannas, and wetlands. Genes regulating body temperature and humid heat, variants aiding the digestion of root crops, melanin levels calibrated to tropical light. Their bodies are the continuation of those who once walked the great Sunda Plain when it still rose above the sea. And there is another legacy, subtler yet deeper, the psychological imprint of water. Southeast Asian cultures carry a unique relationship with water. They love it and fear it, depend on it, yet remain wary of it. Festivals revolve around rivers, beliefs orbit water spirits, cities cling to shorelines. The culture breathes with rain, tides, and floods, as if the collective memory still holds a faint remembrance of a time when the water advanced into the land and erased an entire world. All these threads weave together into a quiet truth. Sunda never truly disappeared. It merely changed form, from land into sea, from forest into coral, from river into deep valley, from pathway into memory, from one continent into hundreds of islands, speaking hundreds of tongues. And once we understand the depth of this heritage, we arrive at a larger question, one that modern science has not yet answered, one that still stirs debate and ignites the imagination of anyone tracing the origins of their world. Was Sunda merely a geological foundation, or was it the cradle of an early civilization we have yet to uncover? As the geographical and biological legacy of Sunda grew clearer, another question, softer, more elusive, and far more contentious, began to surface in conversations among researchers. Was Sunda merely an ancient landmass where scattered forager groups lived, or was it once a gathering point for a higher level of social organization? From that moment, the question did not arise from a desire to mythologize the past, but from a natural intuition. Could a continent nearly the size of India, existing for tens of thousands of years at the crossroads of Asia, Australia, and the Pacific, truly have been just an unnamed forest dotted with a few seasonal camps? At that time, the silence of the seafloor made the question even harder to ignore. In the early 20th century, when the first geological maps of the Sunda Shelf were published, many scholars were unsettled by how vast, flat, humid, and fertile Southeast Asia once was. Some thinkers cautiously proposed that this might have been a place where prehistoric people developed early forms of social organization long before the agricultural centers of the Middle East or China emerged. But lacking material evidence, these ideas were spoken only in whispers. By the late 20th century, genetics opened a new door. Studies of modern human DNA revealed that Southeast Asia was a major crossroads for multiple migration waves out of Africa, as if this region had been humanity's grand intersection for tens of thousands of years. This discovery led some anthropologists to wonder, could Sunda have been a meeting ground, a hub of technical exchange, a point from which populations radiated across Asia and the Pacific? The debate became more vibrant when strange underwater structures appeared. In shallow waters off Java, sonar revealed straight, evenly spaced stone formations, too straight to look fully natural. Some local researchers suggested they might be remnants of man-made structures built when the sea level was low. But geologists remained cautious. Such regularity could also come from tectonic stress or long-term erosion. No one had evidence strong enough to claim either side. A similar situation appeared near Borneo and Bali, where the seafloor showed terrace-like steps. Some immediately linked them to ancient architecture, but deeper analysis showed most were natural terracing formed by waves and tides. Yet even their existence widened the question. If any artificial structures lie beneath Sunda's drowned shelf, do we have the tools or the time to find them? Or have all traces been erased by millennia of rising seas? Within mainstream archaeology, the cautious view still holds. There is no evidence that Sunda once supported an advanced, urban, architectural, metallurgical civilization. What remains, simple stone tools, hearths, cut-marked bones, reflects organized, adaptive hunter-gatherers, but not long-lived systems like cities or temples. Yet the debate persists because of one simple paradox. Most of Sunda lies beneath 40 to 70 meters of dynamic water, shifting silt, strong currents, thick sediments, and terrain difficult to survey in detail. Anything that might have existed, wooden houses, bamboo rafts, shoreline camps, would have been erased by the sea within a single season. We lack evidence, yes, but we also lack the capacity to find evidence. Many scientists admit a quiet but crucial truth. We have surveyed less than 1% of the Sunda seafloor, and most surveys are only broad sonar scans, not true excavations. This does not prove that a lost civilization existed, but it does not prove that it didn't. We stand instead in the gray zone, the zone of possibilities not yet testable. Certain cultural motifs across Southeast Asia make the picture even more intriguing. Seafaring appears early. Populations spread fast and wide in patterns rare for foragers. Early pottery motifs in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Taiwan are so similar that coincidence becomes difficult to argue. These details prompt some scholars to ask, could these similarities all stem from a deeper shared cultural root, one now buried beneath the heart of ancient Sunda? But the most important point is not a bold claim, it is a way of approaching the unknown. With topics like Sunda, we cannot say yes or no with certainty. A continent submerged slowly over millennia is too vast a stage for anyone to assume full understanding. We need humility, the humility to accept that some parts of human history lie beneath water that will never be entirely clear. Perhaps Sunda was only home to organized foraging groups. Perhaps it held early gathering centers, later wiped clean by the sea. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between those two. We do not know. But the not knowing opens a deeper path of reflection. What cultural memories did the peoples around Sunda still carry? What symbols, rituals, and beliefs might still bear the shadow of a land now lost beneath the waves? And from here, the story moves into its next layer, the layer of cultural memory, a realm where Sunda appears not through artifacts or architecture, but through water rituals, ancient symbols, and the subtle patterns of thought that have survived from the time when land became sea. As scientific debates about Sunda remain unresolved, another kind of evidence, softer, harder to measure, yet far more enduring, quietly emerges from the deeper layers of human experience. The spiritual memory of the communities who lived around the drowned continent. From that point onward, we no longer see Sunda through stone, pottery, or ash, but through the way people understood the world, named the world, gave thanks to the world, and feared the world. In that moment, research is no longer archaeology. It becomes an attempt to touch the symbolic layer, something time can distort, but never erase. If we view Southeast Asia as a vast woven tapestry, we begin to see recurring motifs: water, mountains, forest, ancestors, sea, wind. They appear in rituals, lullabies, harvest prayers, even social taboos. What's striking is that these motifs are everywhere, from Vietnam to Cambodia, from Thailand to Indonesia, from Malaysia to the Philippines. The similarities are too wide to be coincidence. They resemble the faint shadow of a shared memory, the memory of a land swallowed by the sea. In many cultures here, the sea is mother, and the mountain is father. The sea nourishes, but also devours. The mountain shelters, but also isolates. That duality mirrors the lived experience of ancient Sundaland, a world constantly shifting between water and land, between the old continent and the new coastlines. When the sea rose, the mother-father of the universe changed positions, and people had to relearn the names of things. One of the strongest spiritual memories appears in rituals that describe water as the path of souls. Among many Austroasiatic and Austronesian groups, water is not just a physical medium, it is an ancestral corridor. The Khmer and ancient Vietnamese used water to invite ancestors home. Early Indonesian communities believed the spirit crossed the sea to return. In the Philippines, many groups placed the dead in boat-shaped coffins, as if the soul needed to cross water to reach the other world. These images repeat far too often not to reflect a deeper, shared experience. The ancestors did cross the sea when they fled the land that was drowning. In Southeast Asian mythology, the motif of the ancestral land, once wide but now gone, appears with astonishing frequency. The Dayak of Borneo speak of an ancient land, stretching to the horizon, now lost beneath the waves. A Javanese legend describes a southern land that now belongs to the bottom of the sea. Vietnamese lore tells the story of Son Tin and Tui Tin, water rising year after year, leaving humans no choice but to climb the mountains. These motifs do not resemble the sudden, punishing floods of Western mythology. Instead, they reflect a different past, a land not destroyed in a day, but slowly taken by the sea, season by season, generation by generation. Even the symbols carry the shape of the drowned continent. On ancient Indonesian architecture, boat motifs appear everywhere. In Palawan and Mindanao, boat-shaped coffins lie deep inside caves. In Vietnam, dragon boats, funerary boats, and ritual canoes appear strikingly early. These variations all communicate the same idea. Crossing water is the passage into another realm, exactly as it would have been for communities that watched their homeland disappear beneath the sea. The motif of the water creature stretches across the region like a long, collective memory. The Khmer and Thai Naga, the Javanese Makara, the Vietnamese dragon, all are tied to rain, the sea, and the power to command water's flow. These creatures do not merely express fear of the sea. They express reverence toward the force that once reshaped the human world. It is difficult to believe such mythical beings are unrelated to the era of rising seas, an era imprinted on the collective mind for millennia. Another layer of spiritual memory lies in the belief that ancestors do not die. They simply move to the land across the water. In Kalimantan, that belief remains. The ancient Cham believed their ancestors returned through the sea gate. The Batak of Sumatra believed spirits resided in tall trees, the very trees growing on high ground where people fled when the waters rose. Each belief is like a shard of mirror, reflecting a shared experience. When the land vanished, the living climbed upward, and the dead drifted outward with the tide. The most delicate memory is how Southeast Asians imagine the ancestral homeland, not in the sky, not beneath the earth, but underwater. A rare vision in world cosmology. They imagine a submerged landscape, not radiant, not divine, simply dim and distant, just like Sundaland when it disappeared. Water, therefore, becomes the symbol of world renewal. Songkran's water festivals, the Khmer New Year's cleansing rituals, Buddhist bathing rites, countless rain-invoking ceremonies, all use water to reset time. But beneath the surface, they may also refresh an older memory, the memory of a world that once changed shape because of water. From all of these signs, we recognize a truth both soft and sharp. Sunda does not live only in geology. Sunda lives in spiritual memory. It lives in the places where people build boats, hold rituals, call the wind, place the ancestral altar, or tell stories to their children. A continent vanished, but its shadow remains in how people understand the world. Yet spiritual memory, as powerful as it is, cannot replace what lies beneath 40 to 70 meters of water. And so the next question bends toward the physical world. Today, can we find more material evidence of Sunda? And if we can, do we need better technology or simply more time? As the spiritual memories of Southeast Asian peoples continued whispering about a sunken continent, 21st century science stepped into its role, descending into the cold, dark regions that were once forests, grasslands, and home to tens of thousands of ancient people. From that moment, researchers no longer observed only from shorelines or from soil dug on surviving islands. They began lowering machines to the very sea floor, where waves and time had kept their secrets sealed for more than 10,000 years. At that point, science was no longer a straightforward search. It became a patient journey of peeling back the layers of memory that water had folded over. One of the first tools to transform the field was multi-beam sonar, a technology that turned the pitch-black seafloor into bright three-dimensional maps. Through sonar, the ancient river systems of Sundaland emerged like deep carvings in stone. Winding channels, submerged floodplains, the wide valleys that once fed wildlife and humans. Every curve on the seafloor was not just terrain. It was a story of water flow, of seasonal floods, of the migration paths where herds once moved between forest and plain. But sonar could only reveal the shape of the lost world. The story of the people lay in the sediments, the silent mud that guarded secrets and revealed them only when touched the right way. And so scientists turned to ancient sediment DNA, a technique that separates microscopic genetic fragments buried beneath the seafloor to see what pieces of the past still remain. The first results were enough to make researchers pause and breathe slower. In mud gathered from the region between Vietnam, Malaysia, and Borneo, they found DNA from tropical forest trees, species that cannot survive underwater. In other samples, there were traces of deer, wild boar, birds, and even bacteria associated with human hearths. Not human DNA, but signs of the microbial signatures left around ancient fires. Tiny organisms, but powerful evidence that people once cooked, lived, and moved across land now lying 50 to 70 meters beneath the sea. In the shallow waters off Java and Sumatra, autonomous underwater robots recorded images of large stones arranged in arcs. When modeled, they appeared pushed in the same direction, perhaps by waves, or perhaps by ancient fish weirs. No one dares to conclude either way, but their presence echoes familiar patterns from riverside sites on land. Early people interacted with water far more than we often imagine. Meanwhile, underwater LiDAR teams focused on the shallow regions around Borneo and Sulawesi. Their scans revealed smooth, gently curving rises, shapes that resembled seasonal occupation mounds. They cannot yet be called man-made structures, but neither can they be dismissed as pure coincidence of waves. They sit exactly where the final high ridges of Sunda remained before the waters rose, the logical places where people would have held on as the continent shrank around them. At the same time, hydrodynamic modelers tried a different approach. Instead of searching for sites, they simulated the pathways humans would have taken as the sea advanced. By modeling ancient topography, decade by decade sea level rise, and the mobility patterns of hunter-gatherers, they reconstructed 3 major migration corridors out of Sunda. One northward into the Vietnam-Cambodia region, one westward along the Malay Peninsula, and one dispersing eastward into the islands of Indonesia. Astonishingly, these 3 paths align almost perfectly with the distribution of modern language families. This does not mean there was a lost civilization. It tells us something more important. The collapse of Sunda was powerful enough to reshape the entire human map of the region. Yet even with advanced technology, Sunda remains one of the most challenging archaeological landscapes on Earth. Robots cannot dig deep into soft seabed sediment without destroying the layers. Sediment cores must be taken slowly, painfully slowly, to avoid mixing thousands of years of history. And every small sample requires months of analysis just to form a single cautious conclusion. Science stands before a strange paradox. We know more than ever before, yet the most important part, the actual lived world of those vanished communities, still lies out of reach, as if Sunda wants us to know enough not to forget it, but not enough to touch it completely. And even though the physical evidence is still sparse, these fragments assemble into a quiet but sharp sensation. We are beginning to hear the echo of a drowned world. The echo is faint, but unyielding, like waves tapping gently on a reef, reminding us that there was once a continent where people watched the sun rise over plains now resting at the bottom of the sea. And from here, as science finishes the part it can tell, the story of Sunda moves into its final layer, the layer that concerns us directly. When people of the 21st century look back at this vanished land, we do not see only the past, we see the future. Because the sea is rising again, and what happened to Sunda may yet become a prophecy for our own fate. As submersible robots returned with thin layers of silt from the seafloor, as sonar redrew the ancient riverbeds that once flowed across what is now the deep blue South China Sea, and as sediment DNA revealed faint shadows of forests, animals, and long-extinguished hearths, one realization slowly surfaced. The story of Sunda is not only a story of the past. From that moment, it became a kind of mirror, not to reflect a vanished continent, but to reflect our own world. At that moment, what happened more than 10,000 years ago was no longer distant. It curved gently, almost naturally, towards the present. Because at its core, Sunda is the story of rising seas, slow, steady, unending. When we say Sunda sank, we are describing a world where the ocean rose meter by meter across countless generations, where plains became bays, where forests turned into seafloors, where people had to change their homes, their habits, and even the rhythm of their thoughts. Strangely, that story is almost identical to what is happening around us, except our age does not grant us thousands of years to adapt. The ancient Sundanese watched the rising water and stepped back with its pace, into the hills, up the mountains, or out to sea on crude wooden vessels. They had time to understand that the world was shifting beneath them. But we, the people of the 21st century, live differently. Today's sea level rise is faster than at any period since the Ice Age, accelerated by heat and melting ice. The projections for the end of this century look eerily similar to reconstructions of Sunda before it vanished. The only difference is that this time, the witnesses are us. What makes Sunda important is not a warning, it is a pattern. The people of Sunda had no meteorology, no predictive models, no satellite readings. But they possessed something we often forget, the ability to listen to nature. When the sea rose, they did not debate whether it was real. They did not remain simply because they wished to keep what they had. They observed, they understood, they moved. And their movement was not an escape. It was a way of flowing with the breath of the earth. Yet the lesson of Sunda is not merely move when the water rises. It is something deeper. The world always changes, and people always find a way, if they are willing to look directly at that change. The story of Sunda also reminds us of the fragility of things that seem eternal. Sundaland was nearly the size of India, full of forests, rivers, wildlife. To its earliest inhabitants, nothing could have suggested that such a land could disappear. But it did. Not in a single day, but in a long cycle only visible to later generations. Today, many major cities, Bangkok, Jakarta, Manila, Saigon, Singapore, sit on land just meters above sea level, much like the vast plains of ancient Sunda. Regions like the Mekong Delta, the Chao Phraya Basin, and the Irrawaddy Delta were built from soft sediment. And softness means vulnerability when the water rises. This is not a call to fear. It is simply a reminder that the greatest landscapes still answer to the laws of water. slow, silent, but unyielding. Sunda offers another lesson. When the world changes, life does not disappear. It branches. As the continent submerged, the people of Sunda diverged into major cultural and linguistic families: Austroasiatic, Austronesian, and others. They adapted to mountains, forests, bays, coastlines, and islands. Their dispersion created the dazzling diversity of Southeast Asia today. Hundreds of languages, countless traditions, and cultures shaped by boats, winds, tides, and the moon. In other words, change does not only take, it also gives. From the drowning of land came new skills: reading the sky, understanding tides, crafting boats, voyaging across open seas, and telling those journeys in story and song. These gifts helped ignite the Great Pacific Migrations, among the longest voyages humans have ever made. But the deepest meaning of Sunda lies in this: history does not rise in a straight line. It moves in rhythms: land rising, land sinking, forests spreading, forests receding, people arriving, people departing, the ocean retreating, the ocean returning. And human beings, in any era, endure only when they move with that rhythm, not when they cling to a single shape of the world. In an age when climate change moves faster than many societies can adapt, the story of Sunda comes as a quiet breath, a gentle reminder that we are not the first generation to face a shifting world, and that the same qualities that once helped the people of Sunda survive, observation, flexibility, patience, are still the qualities we need to go on. The journey into Sunda reaches its final bend, the point where the story is no longer about geology or ancient people, but about us. The understanding that history does not vanish, it only changes form, and that within every change of the present, there is a faint echo of what once happened beneath those deep blue waters 10,000 years ago. As the journey carries us through ancient layers of silt, through sunken riverbeds, through newly formed shorelines, and through the spiritual memories lingering in rituals and stories, we begin to recognize something the people of Sunda long ago may never have imagined. Their story is in many ways our story. From that moment, history stops being a distant sequence of dates or a set of curves on a paleogeographic chart. It becomes a thin mirror, reflecting what every human generation eventually faces: change, loss, renewal, and the ability to keep moving amid forces far larger than one lifetime. When we look at Sunda, what stops us is not only the vastness of a landmass once almost the size of India, but the quiet fragility beneath everything that once seemed solid. A grassland that sheltered ancient elephants and red deer now lies deep beneath blue water. A river that once sustained thousands now rests in silence under layers of sediment. Forests that once connected Vietnam to Borneo survive only as scattered islands, small dots on a modern map. And yet, through all that unyielding transformation, people continued on. They did not place their past in a sealed box. They carried it with them, through language, through boats, through ritual, through the names they gave the world. Sunda invites us to consider that the essence of human history has never been stillness. It has always been movement, not a straight upward line, but a spiral that opens and closes, closes and opens. Some things vanish from the ground, yet persist in the stream of the human mind. They change shape, just as Sunda shifted from land to water, from forest to coral, from personal memory to collective memory. It also gives us a different way to think about endurance. We often imagine memory being preserved through writing, stone, monuments. But the memory of Sunda traveled through 10,000 years without a single lasting structure to hold it. It lived in flood myths, in dragon and naga symbols, in funeral rites that guided souls across water, in reverence for the sea, in the soft fear of monsoon winds. It lived in the spiraling rhythms of stone drums, in wave-like patterns carved onto pottery, in rituals inviting ancestors to return by way of the water. Sometimes, when we read old stories, they feel too distant, too symbolic. But when we place them beside a map of ancient Sundaland, they sound almost like echoes of something real. Not metaphor, but memory, preserved in imagination, the only substance capable of surviving 10 millennia. The deepest truth Sunda offers is the reminder that a stable world is only the illusion of a moment. The shorelines we see today are temporary lines. The civilizations we believe to be solid are only folds on a map the Earth redraws again and again. The bright coastal cities of our time are no different from the small, fire-lit camps of the ancient Sundanese. Both stand on ground that can change shape over a span longer than one human life. History, in that sense, is not something we hold. It is something we stand inside, between what is past and what is coming. Before us lived those who saw the world in a different shape. After us will come those who see it differently still. Sunda teaches us this humility, the humility of knowing that we are only a single breath in a cycle far larger than ourselves. And yet, within that humility lies a gentle beauty, the beauty of adaptation. The Sundanese did not sink with their continent. They rose, they moved, they learned the wind, read the waves, carved boats, crossed seas. From flooded valleys, they created maritime cultures that would one day carry people deep into Polynesia. From leaving their plains behind, they created one of the richest tapestries of languages and traditions on Earth. From a sinking continent, they sparked one of humanity's great migrations. We do not look to Sunda to find tragedy. We look to Sunda to find vitality, to see that people always find a path forward, even if that path leads through deep water, strong winds, or the blurred uncertainty of the future. In a world now facing climate change, the story of Sunda whispers something light as breath. Resilience does not come from keeping everything the same, but from accepting that the world will change and learning to change with it. But before this journey closes, there remains one final layer, the layer any long story eventually turns toward, our place in the flow of time, and the quiet peace that comes from realizing that no matter how wide history stretches, every person still carries a small, meaningful role in its shifting rhythm. As the journey through Sunda carries us past layers of ancient Earth, past the early humans who walked its plains, past the spiritual memories that survived in rituals and stories, past the rising seas and even the faint echoes cast forward into our future, we arrive at the final layer, the place where all long histories, no matter how vast, eventually drift. The realization that every landscape is temporary, and that time is the strongest current humanity has ever known. From that moment, the story of Sunda stops being a story about rock or water. It becomes a quiet but profound conversation between human beings and time itself. And in that stillness, we see clearly that even the largest continents are only passing guests in a universe where nothing stays the same forever. What touches us when we look at the Sunda shelf is not its immense size, but the way it lived for so long, then disappeared so slowly, until the sea left behind a shoreline so calm it seems as if nothing had ever been there at all. In that slow vanishing, we feel as though we are staring at our own memory. The things we believe eternal are often only pausing for a moment, then sinking away while we are busy looking somewhere else. Time is never hurried. It does not erase with one dramatic strike. It simply takes a little at a time, just as the sea took Sunda, season by season, decade by decade, lifetime by lifetime. Those who lived through it never knew they were witnessing an ending. Only far later did descendants look back and whisper, "A continent disappeared." It is no different today. A familiar riverbank, a forest we think will always stand, a piece of land we believe permanent. All of them will eventually change shape, not because anything is wrong, but because time is doing what time always does. Sunda reminds us that no boundary truly belongs to us. The borders we draw on maps are only strokes of ink across a surface that is always moving. The Great Plains we imagine as fixed, the Mekong Delta, the Chao Phraya Basin, the coasts around Manila, Jakarta, or Singapore, sit on land that has risen and sunk through countless cycles of the sea. One day, they too will follow that rhythm, just as the ancient rivers of Sunda once bent their courses when the water reached the last roots of the tallest trees. And yet, within this impermanence, humans found a way to hold on. By remembering. Not remembering the place itself, but remembering the connection between people and land, between people and water, between people and the larger movements that shaped them. The ancient Sundanese did not carry their old forests or rivers with them, but they carried the knowledge of reading the wind, building shelters, moving with the seasons, trusting that water always has a voice. These memories did not sink with the continent. They changed shape, just as Sunda did. And when we consider that, we understand something very gentle. Time can take the form, but not the meaning. A continent's disappearance is not an erasure. It is a reminder that the world is always living, always shifting, always creating new shapes. If everything stayed the same, humans might never have learned to travel far, to read the sky, to form languages, rituals, memories. Change itself is the doorway of creation, a truth the people of Sunda expressed in every step they took along their long migration paths. Time also tells us that no loss is truly empty. Beneath the sea, the ashes of ancient fires still rest, silent but not gone. In the monsoon winds, there is a faint breath of the forests that once stretched across thousands of kilometers. In the DNA of Southeast Asian peoples today, there are traces of long journeys across forests, grasslands, and lands now drowned beneath the waves. In ritual offerings, there is the soft echo of seasons when their ancestors watched the waters rise. Perhaps that is why Sunda moves us in a way that is nearly wordless. It does not speak of empires, victories, or ruins. It speaks of movement, the movement of water, the movement of people, the movement of memory. It tells us that what matters is not how much we manage to hold on to, but how we choose to continue when the world changes shape. And as we watch Sunda sink into calm blue water, we see something we often forget. Land is what we stand on, not what we own. The borders we spend centuries drawing are thin marks on ground that has never stopped shifting. Even the coastline, something we imagine as solid, is never still. In that depth, we realize the true map of the world is not made of continental lines, but of what people carry within them. Patience, resilience, the ability to remember, the ability to adapt, the ability to tell the story forward to those not yet born. And as we gently close this final layer of reflection, we understand that the journey through Sunda was never only about finding a sunken continent. It was to ask something softer, deeper. Where do we stand in the flow of time? And what will remain when the place beneath our feet changes shape? The answer, like all the most important answers, does not lie in rock or water, but in how we live, in how we listen to the world, and in how we accept that we too are part of that eternal movement. As this long journey reaches its final stretch, we do not arrive at a period. We arrive at a sandbar, freshly revealed after the water pulls back, still warm with sunlight, its thin lines of time appearing and fading as if trying to whisper something soft. From that moment, the story of Sunda, woven through stone, through sea, through sediment, through myth, through the footsteps of ancient people, no longer belongs to the past. It becomes part of the present breath, a faint but steady tone, like the patient rhythm of waves touching the reef even when no one is listening. Sunda was once land, then sea, then memory, then a mirror held up to our own existence. It had no empire, no stone monuments, no legends of conquests. And yet its simplicity makes it closer to human life than almost any other story, because most of human history was not carved in thrones or annals, but in riverside camps, in crude boats, in quiet footsteps, in stories told beside the fire. When we look back on the whole journey, what stands out is not disappearance, but movement. Sunda did not end. It shifted form. Its people did not vanish. They carried the world they had lived in and planted it across hundreds of islands. Its languages did not die. They branched into some of the largest families in Asia. Its forests did not fade. They became the sediments that feed coral reefs, creating some of the richest seas on Earth. And memory, fragile, lighter than stone, turned out to be the most enduring of all. We see it in water festivals, in flood myths, in the forms of dragons, nagas, and makaras, in the way Southeast Asians treat the sea like a relative, in the softness of a culture that has always known how to bend with the current instead of resisting it. Somewhere deep in the collective mind, people still remember that the sea once took their ancestors' homeland. There is science in this story, yes. There is reflection, and there is a layer stitched with quiet imagination. But all of it carries us toward one gentle truth. History is never complete, but it is always enough to remind us that we are one brief note inside a much larger measure of time. When we ask how a landmass as vast as Sunda could disappear, the answer comes slowly, like a breeze. Because Earth is always moving, and change is not the exception, it is the rule. When we ask what remains after 10,000 years, the answer becomes even softer. Whatever people carried with them. And when we look toward the future, where sea levels continue to rise, where climates continue to shift, where places we know today may take on new shapes, we cannot help remembering Sunda. Not to fear, but to understand. Because every time the world changes, humans have found a way forward, just as their ancestors did. Survival has never meant keeping everything the same. Sometimes, it simply means keeping the ability to listen and the courage to move on. Perhaps that is why the story of Sunda, despite being about a drowned land, carries such a gentle tone. It is not a tragic melody. It is a low, steady hum with a touch of dawn sea breeze, something that holds both a hint of longing and a quiet assurance that life always continues in its own way. And now, as we close this journey, we can look at any sea and understand that beneath its surface lies more than sand and coral. It might be ancient forest. It might be an old river. It might be the footprints of early humans, or the paths they once chose as the waters rose. That is Sunda, not gone, only moved into a quieter chamber of the Earth's memory. This story ends softly, like a breath. No declarations, no final verdicts, no demand to believe anything. It simply opens a small space for each of us to ask, in the long river of time, what truly remains? Perhaps the answer is not on any map. It lives in how we listen to what the water once hid, and how those stories still find their way back into the light.